The wreck field groaned around him like an old man's bones, flexing and settling in the thin drag of charged dust that passed for air this close to the ring. Valkyr drifted amid the broken shapes of dead ships and shattered cargo pods, his hull camouflaged in heat-scored plates and rusted latticework, his drives masked behind a slow, coughing sputter that imitated the failing reactors of the wreckage he hid among. A tug of inertia spun a twisted freighter carcass beside him, and for a moment the swollen, blackened mass of its hull eclipsed his view of Saul. Then it moved on, and the light of the human star bled through. He saw the cage before he saw the star in full. It rose across his forward port like a horizon made of stone, a band of structures so immense that his ship's sensors grumbled and returned useless numbers. It was not a single wall but a nested lattice, a ring of rings, a halo of colossal pylons and segmented bulwarks that wrapped around the sun's gravity well with an almost obsessive completeness. Angular bastions jutted outward on kilometer-spanning trusses, their undersides stained with the soot of 1,000 burn plumes, their surfaces armored in layered ceramics and dark metallic scales that drank his scanners, probing waves. Between them hung curtains of sensor webs and mine cords that glimmered faintly when his ship's dim drive plume brushed them with light. Beyond these were the heavier elements, bastion fortresses the size of small moons, cold and patient, studded with gun arrays and missile cradles that could erase fleets. It had the look, to Vale's alien eyes, of something that had not been built in haste. This was not a panicked barricade thrown up overnight. It was old, worn at the edges like a tool used so often that its handle had taken on the ghost of the hands that gripped it. He could see it in the scarring along the great pylons where weapons had fired, and fired again, in long-ago skirmishes. He could see it in the patched plates where something had struck and been repelled. He could see it in the great accumulations of debris that clung to the ring's outer skeleton like barnacles on an ancient ship, drifts of broken drones, shattered gun casings, burned-out torpedoes, and hull fragments that had once belonged to those who had tested this wall and broken upon it. His collection of coalition briefings had called it the interdiction structure, Sol primary containment. They had spoken of its dimensions in numbers too large to mean anything, its firepower in abstract ratios, its strategic importance in measured phrases. None of that had captured the feeling of it up close. Here, with the ugly stumps of dead ships tumbling beside him and the ring slowly blotting out more and more of the stars, it felt less like a machine and more like an old legend given metal and mass. There was something of folklore in the way it curved around the sun, like a ring of standing stones around a haunted hill, placed there by hands that had known fear and had answered it by building. Vale watched the approaching spines of the blockade with the same quiet attention he had once given to the fortress walls of his childhood homeworld. He remembered standing on a dusty plateau beneath a sky streaked with migrating thunderclouds, staring at the gray sweep of city walls that had stood for 9 centuries against raiders and storms. He had been a boy then, his only wore the tussles of the children's courts. His elders had told him the walls would stand for 9 more centuries. They had fallen 12 years later, under the first human raid. The memory ghosted across his mind and then slipped away, leaving only the familiar, thin taste of old ash. He adjusted course with a minuscule tap from his lateral jets, enough to make his cobbled-together wreck drift a little closer to a slowly tumbling freighter hulk ahead. The hulk's broken spine and twisted cargo lattice would serve as cover if any of the ring's long-range scanners swept this patch of garbage with more than casual interest. His own hull, a small courier ship stripped down and dressed in corpse metal, hugged the freighter's shadow, letting the larger mass take the brunt of the passive radiation and thermal signatures. Approach vector holding, his ship's whispering systems reported in his inner ear, the translation band smoothing the mechanical clicks into his own tongue. Projected ring-plane intersection in 31 standard minutes. He grunted a quiet acknowledgement. The disguise was good, built by dedicated hands back at the Coalition's covert yards. Heat sinks and crooked armor plates, smeared with the true corrosion and scarred alloy of real battlefield salvage, a reactor tuned to sputter and cough like a dying heart. The transponder emitted a ragged, barely coherent identifier belonging to a long-lost smuggler craft, last recorded slipping through the fringes of the Sol blockade 2 decades ago. They had even welded empty crates and broken conduit lengths to his hull, so that any visual sweep would see only broken freight and not the sleek, compact geometry of an infiltration courier. The coalition believed in thoroughness when it was afraid. And the coalition, for all its brave communiques and grand assemblies, was afraid of this place. His gaze slid to the display where the Sol system was rendered as a ghost map. Here, reality shrank to lines and points. The bright mass of the sun at center, each planet annotated with symbols and old strategic markings. Beyond the ring's orbit, there were faint scars in the data. He enlarged one, a jagged, hazy ellipse of sensor noise just outside Neptune's path. The residue of a battle 30 years past, where a task force of the coalition's finest had tested the blockade's resilience and found it not wanting. 5 heavy cruisers, 12 escorts, and a carrier group had gone in. Nothing had returned. After that, the coalition had stopped testing by force. The ring had settled back into its silent vigil, and the humans behind it, those strange, fierce primates whose first warships had torn through his people's skies with the indifference of a storm, had gone quiet. That quiet was why Vale was here. He could still hear the counselor's voice from the last briefing in the dim war chamber aboard the flagship. Measured, even the sound of a mind that believed in systems and arguments and the ability of reason to pin down chaos. "We cannot abide unknowns of this magnitude," the counselor had said, his many-fingered hands steepled before his chest, his eyes, a mottled, faded green, fixed on Vale. "We caged the humans. We bled them to make that cage. We cut their lines, shattered their outposts, sealed their gates. They should rage. They should throw themselves at the bars. That is the pattern we know, but they do not. They stopped raiding 10 years ago," another had added, a thin woman from the outer fleets whose face carried a faint web of scars, a consequence of uncompromising duty on worlds where humans had left their mark. "Stopped probing the ring. Stopped sending their little smuggler craft outward except for a trickle. No more hit-and-run strikes on our depots, no more piracy on the deep trade routes. The reports from the outer cordons read like weather reports. Perhaps we finally broke them," someone had murmured. Laughter had answered that, a dry, humorless sound that did not move Vale at all. "We have not broken them," the counselor had said. "Our history with them does not support that conclusion. They adapt, they endure, they metamorphose under pressure. When they lose one path, they gnaw another through the rock. Humans do not stop. Therefore, when they appear to stop, we must assume we do not understand what they are doing." In the long silence that followed, Vale had felt his own pulse beating slowly in his throat. He had been there when the humans first spilled into coalition space, their early drives shrieking against the fabric of the void, their ships ugly and formidable, bristling with raw weaponry. He had seen worlds burned and taken, and others spared without clear reason. He had watched treaties signed and betrayed, watched human commanders hold their fire when they might have annihilated a retreating column of his fleet. They were not beasts. They were something stranger, a kinship of logic and passion perpetually on the edge of madness, but not quite falling. "The Sol blockade has stood for 43 years, the counselor had continued. "Long enough that some among us call it ancient, which is absurd but telling. We have grown used to its presence, as one grows used to a cliff at the edge of one's field. But that cliff was formed by the eruption of a volcano. The ground beneath our feet is still warm. We need to know what changes are occurring behind that horizon. Are they building anew? Are they dying? Are they dreaming a war we do not yet understand?" Vale had inclined his head. He knew why he had been chosen, and not just because he had infiltrated human space before, wearing other faces and carrying other names. He had the patience to dwell in an enemy's silence without flinching, the curiosity to listen to words that were not meant for him, the discipline to remain a shadow when his instincts cried out to act. And there was perhaps something else. In him, a small, unadmitted thread of fascination with the species that had toppled his childhood walls and yet somehow had produced poets whose words he now kept in a private cache. "Learn why," the counselor had said. "Not statistics, not rumors. Why? From the inside, as you have done before. The humans must believe you to be a defecting smuggler, seeking sanctuary or profit. That will give you cause to approach their ports, their stations. They still accept outcasts. We know that from the few who have slipped through. You will go in alone. You will not have extraction. The ring will not open for you a second time." Vale had held the counselor's gaze. "Understood. And Valkyr," the scarred woman had added, "if the reason they have gone quiet is a weapon and not a surrender, we need to know how long we have before the cage we built becomes a cocoon that bursts from the inside." Now, drifting in the shadow of a dead freighter, he watched the first of the blockade's guardians turn their attention to him. On the tactical display, icons brightened, long-range sensor platforms pivoting like patient heads, orbital forts adjusting their gaze. Invisible waves combed through the wreck field, tasting for patterns that did not belong. His disguise held its breath with him. Passive K-scan, Band 3, the ship whispered. Active thermal sweep commencing from station designation K-72. K-73, K-74, Vale did not move. Movement was signature. Signature was death. He let the freighter's bulk hang between him and the nearest sensor outgrowth, let the slow rotation of shattered metal carry his little craft in an almost lazy arc. He watched as the sweeping cones of detection painted his overlays and then slid past. A faint tremor in his hull told of distant gravitic fingers probing the wreck's swarm for hidden mass. The courier's frame remained limp, its mass profile matching that of its false plating and ballast. The sweep moved on. The bastions at this section of the ring went back to their patient, slow vigil. The ring had seen a great deal of death. It no longer roused easily. Vale exhaled carefully. Even his breathing felt sacrilegious here, as if he were a trespasser in an old temple, stepping between towering columns while some buried god listened for the sound of his footfalls. The blockade loomed, gun towers like broken teeth, defense platforms like coiled fists, nets of shimmering energy and dispersed mines like webs between ancient stones. It encircled the sun in a complete band. Even the gaps that appeared on visual were illusions, obscured by carefully tuned refraction fields and overlapping patrol paths. There was no obvious hole. Only the gaps humans had made for themselves, and which his handlers had labored to learn. The wreck field was one such gap. The Coalition's intelligence had discovered, years ago, that the humans periodically vented, cleared debris from the inner system outward through specific corridors, using remote tug drones and carefully managed microflare bursts to herd the garbage through a safe channel in the ring. The ring's guns stayed quiet for these streams. The nets parted just enough to let the junk bleed outward into the deeper dark. For a smuggler with patience and knowledge, these waste rivers were a path in and out, a path dangerous enough that very few dared use them, and those who did were either half-mad or desperate beyond caring. His disguise took the form of one such desperate soul. Debris corridor breach perimeter in 2 minutes, the whispering systems informed him. Local traffic, 3 tug drones, 1 manned salvage rig, designations match human registry codes. Vale magnified the view. The salvage rig appeared as a humped silhouette in the near distance, nestled among the tumbling trash, its hull worn but intact. Light spilled from a handful of forward ports. Tug drones flickered around it, tiny sparks against the vector lines of the ring's automated flight path. Beyond, at the far edge of the safe corridor, he could see the faint shimmer of a force lattice where the ring's inner shield layers bent, making way for the junk stream to pass. He let himself drift closer, still buried in the shadow of his freighter corpse. The rig did not seem to notice him. That was good. Contact this early would be dangerous. He thought, briefly, of turning back. The thought came with no more weight than a whisper, the way an old wound sometimes twinges in cold air. Turn back and you live a few more years, running quiet routes in safe space, avoiding this haunted star. Turn back and the humans remain an unanswered question. Turn back and the Coalition remains blind to whatever it is that has stilled these warriors who once screamed across his sky. He remembered the walls of his home collapsing, remembered the heat of the fires that followed, remembered the look on the human commander's face when she had walked through the ash, not gloating, not cruel, just tired, as if every burned stone had added to some weight she already carried. He remembered overhearing her tell an aide, in a language he had not yet understood, "We can't keep doing this." Years later, he translated the phrase. He still carried it like a thorn. He did not turn back. The tug drones ahead signaled to the ring in bursts of coded light, announcing their readiness to pass. The faint shimmer ahead thickened into the outflow aperture, a section of the blockade's inner shield momentarily attenuating, the overlapping nets pulling back like lips parting to let breath out. Beyond that, the inner system glowed. The harsher light of the unfiltered sun, the glint of orbital stations and traffic threads, the pale beads of worlds. It was strange, he thought, that the Coalition spoke of the humans as caged when the ring, seen from here, seemed to hold the light in, not out. Aligning to debris flow, his systems whispered. Minimal thrust, maintain collision avoidance protocols. The wreck field around him began to move with new coherence, drawn inward along invisible lines. The tug drones pulsed commands, massive clumps of hull and junk shifted, forming a loose, hollow stream aimed at the opening gap. Vale let his courier ship be carried along, a mote in a river of dead metal. As the aperture yawned larger, he caught his first clear glimpse of the ring's inner face. No less armored than the outer, but pitted and stained from an age of solar radiation and the occasional inward blast. Along its curvature he saw other apertures, smaller and more heavily guarded, through which armed patrols could launch or return. The debris river reached the aperture. The first wave of junk slid through the weakened shields, stirring faint flares of light where fields and metal kissed. Vale's hull shivered as the ship crossed that threshold, as if some ancient boundary had been passed. For a heartbeat he felt exposed, hung in a narrow throat between teeth. Then he was inside the ring. The light changed. Outside, the sun had been a muted presence, a distant glare filtered through the ring's interfering mass. Inside, it was immediate and fierce, the great star burning white gold against a black that seemed deeper than the outer dark. The inner system unfolded before him like a story told in orbits and reflected rays. Mercury's swift spark, Venus's soft, smothering glow, Earth's blue-white coin, Mars's rustum ember. Beyond them, a haze of curved lines and motes indicated stations, ship paths, habitats. He had seen such maps before, but never from this side. Traffic density, moderate, his systems murmured. Patrol patterns, irregular but non-random. Warning, unauthorized transponder. Recommendations, establish cover identity within local registry as soon as possible. He exhaled once more. Understood. He reached into the dispatch panel and thumbed a chimneyed switch. The transponder stutter that had marked him as dead freight ceased. In its place bloomed a new identity, one of the handful of smuggler codes the Coalition's intelligence believed were still valid in human space. It broadcast in a rough, wavering tone, as if the transmitter were barely holding together. The name encoded within its packets would read, in human registry systems, as Chirohal, independent hauler, marginal reputation, known to have skirted the edges of the blockade more than once. His own name, Valkyr, sank deeper into the coffers of his mind, folded behind the new face. Identity broadcast active, the ship whispered, awaiting challenge from local authorities. It did not take long. A lance of tight beam communications speared across the void, too precise to be accident, originating from a picket station that hung like a dark seed just inside the ring. Vale let the systems intercept it. The translation band rendered the human language in his ear. Unscheduled vessel, transponder Chirohal, you are entering restricted Sol system space. Declare cargo and intent. Vale's reply had been prepared, rehearsed, polished into a weary, believable drawl. Salvage and scrap, he said, letting the translation band cast his words back into their tongue. Same as last time, station. I caught the edge of your garbage river. Figured I'd bring some of it right back where it came from. Better price inside the cage, yeah? There was a pause. He imagined, on the far end, some human operator squinting at a screen, comparing logs, reviewing records of a certain undesirable but tolerated hauler who had, in the past, traded scrap and black market goods for fuel, food, and the peculiar contraband that flowed out of the human system despite the ring. Music, stories, pieces of human art, clipped and carried outward like spores. Record shows last registered entry 19 standard months ago via Pacific Gate, the voice returned, still neutral. Exit via same route 5 days later. Cargo at departure, refined alloys, printed fabric, non-lethal consumables, no interdicted items. You were advised not to return. Yeah, Vale said. Funny thing about advice, never pays my docking fees. Listen, I've got a hold full of good stuff for you, unburnt composites, intact conduits, even a couple of old missile chassis. You know they're hungry for that in the belt yards. I can stay out here and let it all drift into the dark, or I can come in, pay my taxes, and you can see I don't have anything sharper than a blunt spoon in my locker. Your call, friend. He layered just enough fatigue into the last word to suggest a man too long in space, not enough to sound obsequious. Another pause, longer this time. Infiltration training emphasized such moments, the intervals between challenge and response, where unseen hands weighed risk against gain. Human controllers, Coalition trainers had always said, were especially susceptible to arguments framed around waste and efficiency. It offended something in them to throw away potential usefulness, even when their rules told them to. Transfer flight control to station, the voice said at last. You will be directed to lunar reception too. Any attempt to deviate will result in immediate destruction. You will submit to full inspection. You will not power weapons. Vale glanced at his bare defensive grid, currently encoded as half-corroded. "Copy that, station. I live to be inspected." One of his side thrusters fired of its own accord, a gentle nudge, but he knew it was not his doing. Control had been seized by the station, and now his ship rode a new vector, nudged by remote hand toward the faint motes that resolved over minutes into the Earth-Moon system. He surrendered to it. That, too, had been part of the plan. He watched Earth grow. In the early years of the war, every coalition briefing on humanity had started with that planet, shown from orbit. A blue-white marble swirled with cloud, green-brown continents curled around glittering seas. It had been offered as explanation, not excuse. "Look," they had said, "this is the cradle that made them. All that water, all those storms, the wild temperature swings, the cycles of feast and famine. No wonder they are as they are. No wonder they spread." Now, as his ship slid deeper into the well, he saw the familiar image gain new details. Chains of orbital platforms wrapped around the planet like beads on invisible strings. Some were vast, spoked things that glinted with arrays and docking arms. Some were squat and blocky, with armored hides and heat bloom scars. Fortresses, though few, were as heavily armed as the ring behind him. Between them, ships moved. Freighters with bulbous holds, tugboats dragging cargo pods, glittering passenger liners, clusters of tiny automated drones. He had expected the skies to be thick with warships, their silhouettes sharp and predatory, lances and cannons bristling. He saw some, destroyer hulls in high watch orbits, a pair of heavy cruisers idling like watchful sharks near the old geostationary belt, a handful of smaller craft with sleeker forms that could be patrol corvettes. But for the cradle of a species the Coalition considered the most dangerous in known space, it was sparse. There was more traffic around busy trade stations in the inner Coalition worlds. Anomalous military density, his systems observed softly, matching his own disquiet. Expected, high; observed, moderate. Noted, Vale murmured. Maintain visual logs. The moon rose from behind Earth's limb, an old scarred rock gleaming gray, its near side freckled with dark maria and bright crater rims. Human infrastructure clung to it in knots and filaments. Great radiating lines like spiderwebs marked mining conduits and transit tunnels. Domes glowed faintly on the night side, clusters of them like beads of glass pressed into the dust. More stations hung in cislunar space, some old and pitted, others sleek and new. As he approached, Luna filled his view until the planet below it was a curved backdrop. His assigned destination, Luna Reception 2, resolved as a wheel-shaped habitat orbiting a few hundred kilometers above the mare plane. Its spokes ended in broad docking rings. A cluster of modular stacks protruded from one side, with thermal fins fanning outward. The station's skin bore the marks of decades of small impacts and repair patches. It felt, in its quiet, industrious way, not unlike the old river ports of his youth. Functional, a little battered, still open for business. "Unscheduled vessel, this is Luna Reception 2, a new voice said in his ear, this one sharper, carrying a hint of an accent from one of Earth's old oceanic languages. "We have your approach vector. Maintain current course and stand by for berthing instructions. Weapons status check. Confirm offline." "Confirmed," Vale said. He sent the appropriate status packet, all weapon nodes powered down, safeties engaged. It was mostly accurate. The few systems he had that could bite were deeply buried, disguised as structural elements. Docking clamps reached out from the station's ring as his ship coasted into the assigned berth. Magnetic grapples snagged his hull with a clang that shivered through the thin air of his cramped cabin. The sense of motion ceased abruptly. For a moment, he listened to the ticking of contracting metal, the soft hum of life support. In that silence, he was intensely aware that he had crossed the line. He was no longer at the gate, but within the human sphere held by human machines. "Docking complete," the station announced. "Seal integrity, nominal, atmosphere equalization in progress. You will be boarded." Vale unbuckled himself from the couch. He moved with the easy caution of a man born in one gravity and long since accustomed to operating in many. His limbs were slim, his gray skin slightly mottled along the jawline, his eyes a dark, green-tinged hue that few humans would think to question. The bioplastic ridges along his spine, marks of his species, native environment, were concealed beneath the bulky, scuffed flight suit of an aging hauler. In the mirror strip along one bulkhead, he studied his reflection briefly, searching for any trace of Valkyr, the Coalition agent. He saw only Cairo Hal, tired, a little hungry, opportunistic, wary but not dangerous. He palmed the access panel and waited. The lock cycled. The inner hatch iris opens with a hydraulic sigh. The humans came in as he had expected they would. 2 in dark uniforms with white bands at the shoulders and sidearms at their hips, 1 in a lighter utility coverall with a tablet in hand. They wore helmets, the dark visors transparent enough to show faces beneath. The one in front was younger than he had anticipated, her skin the warm brown of an equatorial region, hair cropped short. Her eyes flicked across his cramped cabin and then settled on him with a steadiness that was not yet hard but had learned how to be. "Captain Hal," she said, "welcome back to Saul. Keep your hands where I can see them." He lifted his hands slowly, palms outward, fingers spread. "Officer," he said with a small incline of his head, "happy to be so warmly received." The faintest twist touched one corner of her mouth, there and gone. "We're going to scan your ship. Any undeclared passengers? Weapons? Contraband beyond what's on your manifest?" "I suppose that depends on what your definition of contraband is," Vale replied, then added quickly, "Kidding. The only thing I'm smuggling is a bad attitude and a fondness for cheap whiskey." One of the other officers snorted. The leader's expression did not change, but he saw a hint of softness in her eyes. Her gaze dropped briefly to the scanner on her wrist, which was feeding back data from the station's more invasive probes. Biosignature sweeps, chemical sniffers, structural resonance scans. He held still, letting the waves pass through him. The modifications that hid his species, more obvious anomalies, were good, but he still felt the crawling sensation along his spine where the false ridges met real nerve clusters. "Ship scans show one biosignature," the officer in the coverall murmured, consulting his tablet. "Matches his biometrics from previous dock. No red-hot nodes, no unusual density pockets. Hull's a mess, but that's what you'd expect from picking trash off the outflow. No active hardware besides engines and life support," one of the armed officers added. "Weapons ports show as welded shut." The leader nodded once. "All right, Cairo. Here's how this is going to go. You'll come with us to intake. We'll run you through the usual checks. If you clear, you'll be granted a temporary work visa for Luna and the inner system restrictions. You'll sell your scrap to licensed yards only. You'll stay away from restricted zones. You try to run, you'll be dead before your ship clears docking clamps. You understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Vale said. The term of address felt familiar in his mouth, borrowed from 100 recordings of human speech he'd studied. "And I appreciate the hospitality. I'm just here to make an honest, mostly honest, living." "That be a change," the officer in the coverall muttered. Vale smiled thinly. "People can change." The leader's gaze lingered on his face. For a moment he had the impression that she could see straight through the layers of falsehood to the quiet, alert presence beneath. Then she broke eye contact and stepped aside, gesturing toward the hatch. "Let's find out," she said. There was suspicion, as he'd expected. But there was also a certain gentleness beneath the formality, a refusal to escalate threat without cause. He walked between them down the narrow docking tube, the walls vibrating faintly with station's hums. Through the small viewport slits, he could see Luna's gray curve below, powdered regolith and ancient craters washed in harsh sunlight. Closer, the station's own structural ribs arced, painted in patches where weld scars had been covered like healed skin. A docking bay swallowed them, a cavernous space where other ships rested in their cradles. Some were small, scuffed haulers like his borrowed shell. Others were sleek and clean, emblazoned with corporate marks. Overhead, gantry cranes moved along tracks, silently bearing containers. The air smelled faintly of ozone and lubricants, but also of something else: human density. Sweat, synthetic fabrics, coffee, the familiar scent of a species that packed itself into tight spaces and made them home. They took him through processing in a matter-of-fact sequence. Identity verification, retina scan, fingerprint patterning, DNA check via quick cheek swab. His forged biometrics matched the record of Cairo, how the clandestine services had built out of a real smuggler's stolen identifiers. Customs paperwork, projected in front of him on a translucent panel, requested details of his cargo. He listed the scrap in appropriately tedious detail, watching the human clerk's eyes glaze slightly. A medical technician waved a handheld sensor around his body, checking for pathogens, implants, and contraband embedded in tissue. Vale felt the crawl of that chill field again and kept his breathing even. "Been anywhere interesting since your last visit, Cairo?" the processing clerk asked absently as he tapped through forms. He was older, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a paunch pressing against the fabric of his shirt. The badge at his chest read R. Patel. "Interesting's a matter of perspective," Vale said. ran a few loads along the edge of the Trican expanse, took some foodstuffs out to a mining rig where they hadn't seen a green plant in 2 years. They thought my crate of contraband spices was worth more than the Habs reactor. Ha, Patel said. Bet they did. Any contact with quarantine species, restricted AI, or unsanctioned biotech? Vale made himself look mildly offended. I'm not suicidal. Good answer. Patel's hands moved in practiced motions, approving stamps that were only partly metaphorical now. Your record's not clean, Cairo, but the last time you were here, you played by the rules, mostly. Since then, you've stayed off our most wanted lists. That buys you the benefit of the doubt. Appreciated, Vale murmured. There are fewer of you these days, Patel added, not quite looking at him. Smugglers, runners, used to get a dozen like you a month, looking to make a score on blockade traffic. Now. He shrugged. People say it's not worth the risk anymore. They say we don't pay enough or that we've gotten too good at catching the worst ones. Funny thing is, we haven't changed that much. Maybe the rest of the galaxy just got a little tired. Vale tilted his head. You miss us? Patel snorted. I miss overtime, he said. Take your visa chip. It's valid for 60 standard days, Sol system only, no access beyond Mars without special permit. Stay out of trouble. If you stumble into it anyway, try not to do it on my shift. The chip was a sliver of transparent material, warm against his fingertips. It carried encoded permissions, tracking hooks, probably a few little surprises designed to tell the authorities where he was if he strayed too close to forbidden places. He slid it into the slot on the band at his wrist and felt the faint sting as it paired with his biosignature. They let him go. He stepped out into Luna Station proper, and for the first time since entering the ring, he was among them, the humans. The corridor beyond processing opened into a broad concourse that curved gently with the station's wheel. Artificial gravity pulled at his feet with about a sixth of what he would feel on a coalition-standard habitat, but humans walked in it with the easy familiarity of those who had grown up under many gravities. The ceiling overhead was painted a pale approximation of sky, though the seams between panels were visible if one looked. Light panels mimicked day. Shops lined the walls, food stalls, repair kiosks, market booths where components and fabrics and curiosities traded hands. Signs glowed in human script and symbols, some translated automatically by his band, others left in their native tongues. The murmur of voices made a constant backdrop, spiked with bursts of laughter or the sharp tone of an argument quickly settled. They were not as he remembered them from war footage and battlefield encounters. Those humans had been hard-eyed, shoulders tight, movements clipped, as if sleep were a luxury they could not afford. These, there was a looseness here. Not softness precisely, but a slackening of tension, a sense that the next moment might hold a meal, a joke, a quiet conversation, rather than a missile impact. Faces were still lined, some with scars, but the lines were etched by something more than just strain, by time, by living. He saw a child dart between adults, chasing a small hovering toy. A woman in a maintenance uniform with oil on her hands paused to buy a paper cup of steaming, fragrant liquid from a stall. A pair of men in business attire stood bent over a portable hollow projector, arguing amiably over the placement of some structural feature in a habitat design. Someone played a stringed instrument in a corner, plucking out a tune that his translation band refused to flatten into words, leaving it to vibrate in the air as pure sound. He had expected propaganda posters on every wall, rousing calls to vigilance and hatred. There were posters, announcements for civic meetings, advertisements for a play at a local theater, a recruitment notice for some engineering corps, but none of them screamed. They were quietly persuasive instead, full of practical details and simple images. A hand holding a wrench, a star field overlaid with grid lines, a stylized seed unfurling leaves. The absence of war frenzy felt, oddly, more disorienting than a parade of tanks might have. He walked slowly, letting himself appear the sort of man who had been away too long and was reacquainting himself with the rhythms of a place. His ears picked out snatches of conversation as he passed. They opened a new chamber over the Pacific Arc, I heard. Lines were around the station twice. You can't blame them for being cautious. The bloom changed everything, but that doesn't mean we rush stupid. My brother got a post at Far Light 7, says he hasn't seen a sky in 2 years and doesn't miss it. Words that meant nothing, or perhaps everything. The bloom, the chambers, far lights. The terms matched no entries in his briefings, they must have arisen during the quiet years. He felt the tickle of curiosity tighten in his chest. He turned down a side corridor, away from the concourse's busiest section. Here, the station narrowed. Pipes and conduits ran along the ceiling, some marked with glowing bands to denote high voltage or pressurized fluids. An access hatch stood open, a human technician half inside, her legs sticking out as she muttered to herself about corroded coupling rings. The air grew slightly cooler, the lighting a shade dimmer. He had an appointment of sorts. The coalition had arranged, through intermediaries and cutouts, for his assumed identity to have a reason to be here beyond mere scrap selling. Smugglers survived by having more than one thread in their nets. One of Cairo Hal's threads was supposedly a contact with a minor trade syndicate operating in Luna's shadow markets, a syndicate that bought unusual goods, asked few questions, and had ties to deeper currents in human society. The name he had been given was Myra Holt. The title attached to that name in the sparse file was vague: Warden Engineer, Lunar Infrastructure, Special Projects. It was not much to go on, but in Vale's long experience, some of the most important introductions were made on the back of scant information. He followed the guidance trace mapped into his wristband's overlay, past cargo lifts and residential spokes, down a sloping passage that led toward the station's lower sections. As he descended, the air took on a faint metallic tang. The hum beneath his feet deepened, gaining a pulsing subcurrent like a heartbeat. At a junction, a small queue had formed outside a set of reinforced doors. People stood in twos and threes, some in work gear, some in plain clothes, all carrying small cases or containers. A sign above the doors, once his band translated it, read, Material Intake, Chamber Access, Authorized Personnel Only. A smaller plaque beneath bore a symbol like a stylized flower made of concentric rings. The bloom, he thought, unbidden. He watched as an attendant with a tablet checked each person, scanned their credentials, and admitted them one by one. Through the briefly open doors, he caught a glimpse of a wide elevator with walls that seemed to shimmer faintly, as if something beyond them bent the light. The people went in with expressions that mixed routine with something like reverence. When the elevator closed and descended, the hum in the floor beneath Vale's boots changed pitch for a moment. He suppressed the urge to linger. A stranger loitering near an inner access point would draw attention. Instead, he veered down another corridor, following the overlay's pulsing arrow. Along the way, he passed a viewport. Beyond it, Luna's surface stretched under hard light, the regolith a pale, powdery blanket broken by darker, glassy patches where ancient impacts had melted rock. In the near distance, near the terminator line between day and night, something rose from the surface. A cluster of towers around a central dome, spines and struts and delicate arcs that caught the sunlight and fractured it into faint halos. The structure hummed in the station's seismic sensors, a low, steady vibration that even his alien bones felt. A human worker had stopped at the viewport too. He wore a badge that read V. Shaw and had the relaxed slouch of someone on a break. Vale pointed casually. "What's that one?" he asked in the language of the station, letting the translation band smooth his accent just enough to sound merely foreign, not alien. Shaw glanced where he indicated. "Chamber Complex," he said. "One of the older ones. They started that one just after the bloom began. You knew in system?" "Been a while," Vale said. "Last time I was here, the moon was mostly mines and domes and the odd tourist arc. Chambers are new to me." Shaw huffed a soft laugh. "Yeah, well. Lots new since the last shooting stopped. You'll hear about them." He squinted at Vale's wristband. "Short-term visa? That obvious? Only folks who stare that hard at the chambers are first-timers and inspectors." Shaw straightened, stretching his back. "Don't worry, you won't get near them unless you're cleared. And if you are, you'll know more than me. I just keep the lights on." He nodded and moved away, leaving Vale with the unhelpful word hanging in his thoughts. Chambers, bloom, far lights. He filed them away, puzzle pieces with no picture to fit into yet. The overlay guided him to a quieter section of the station, where the walls narrowed and the footsteps of passers-by echoed more sharply. A security door marked Engineering Level 9 barred his way. He presented his wristband to the scanner. The chip he'd been given at intake held nothing about engineering access, but the Coalition's hidden allies had long fingers. Permissions could be woven invisibly into existing code, like a contraband tune embedded in a popular song. The scanner beeped. The door slid open. Beyond was a world of pipes, conduits, and humming machinery. The corridor ceiling here was low, forcing taller humans to duck slightly. The light came from bare strips fixed along the walls, casting sharp shadows. The air was cooler still, tinged with the smell of ozone and the faint sweetness of coolant. Noise filled the space. A layered tapestry of fan whirs, pump thuds, and the thin, keening whine of some high-frequency apparatus buried deeper within. Vale walked with the careful step of someone trying not to look lost and only partially succeeding. He passed junction boxes with warning stencils, open access panels where tangled cables coiled. A trio of technicians stood around a diagnostic console, arguing quietly about load balancing across some network of systems. None spared him more than a cursory glance. His wristband's embedded code marked him to their local systems as a man with permission to take the route he was on. At last, the path ended at a door unlike the others. This one was plain, unmarked save for a small plaque bearing a serial number. There was no visible handle, only a flat panel at shoulder height. The overlay pulsed. "You have arrived." Vale paused, letting his breathing settle, his mind slip into the quiet, receptive state that had served him well in 100 other thresholds. Then he touched the panel. The door slid aside. The room beyond was not large. A pair of desks, one cluttered with tools and diagnostic tablets, the other almost bare. A set of wall displays that currently showed nothing but simple system schematic loops. Shelves with carefully labeled components, each in its slot. The lighting was softer here, the hum of machinery more distant, as if this place were slightly insulated from the station's ceaseless mechanical churn. A woman sat at the bare desk, her chair tilted back on two legs, booted feet braced against a low cabinet. She was reading something off a thin slate held one-handed, her other hand loosely cradling a mug from which a thin curl of steam rose. Her hair was the color of iron filings, threaded with early strands of white at the temples. Her skin was pale, but not the paleness of someone who never saw stars. It was the paleness of someone whose exposures had taken place mostly under artificial suns. Lines bracketed her mouth and eyes, not harshly, but in the way of someone who had spent many years squinting thoughtfully at stubborn problems. She wore a simple gray work jacket with a patch on the shoulder that bore the stylized ring flower symbol he had seen near the chamber doors. She looked up as the door opened. Her eyes were gray, not the cold metallic gray of some northern ice world he had visited, but the soft, stormy gray of clouds that had seen rain. They rested on him with a calm, steady assessment, taking in his stance, his clothes, the little tells he had trained so hard to bury. For a moment, neither spoke. The door slid shut behind him with a hush that felt, to Vale, almost like a ceiling. "Cairo Hal," she said at last, naming the identity he wore, not the one hidden beneath. Her voice held a depth he hadn't expected, a low, even cadence that carried both weariness and patience. "You're late." He let his lips twist into a half-smile. "Traffic," he said. "The trash rivers are getting crowded. Aren't they always?" She set the slate aside, letting the chair's front legs thump back down. "You can stand there and pretend to be just another hauler for a few more minutes if you like, or you can sit down and we can talk like two people who both know that's not why you're here." Every instinct screamed caution. He kept his posture easy, tilted his head, narrowed his eyes just enough to mimic amusement tinged with wariness. "You're Myra Holt, I take it," he said. "Word was you'd have a job for a man with my talents. If you're already accusing me of not being what I say I am, we're starting off very oddly." She gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "We live in odd times," she said. "Sit, please." He crossed the room at a measured pace, letting his gaze flicker around with the curiosity of someone sizing up a potential employer, not an enemy. Up close, the hum in the air felt subtly different, as if some deeper frequency pulsed beneath the ordinary station sounds. He sat, feeling the chair's worn padding give under his weight. "You have a reputation," she said, folding her hands loosely on the desk. "In certain circles." Cairo Hal, hauler of inconvenient cargo, ferry of people who'd rather not appear on official manifests, survivor of the occasional scrape with our blockade. You take risks, but not stupid ones. You've been here before and left without causing us intolerable trouble. That makes you useful." "Flattered," Vale said, "but you don't sound thrilled to see me." "I'm not thrilled by much these days," she replied. The corner of her mouth quirked, but it wasn't quite a smile. "And useful tools can still be dangerous if you don't know what they're really made of." She cocked her head. "Tell me something, Cairo. What's a man like you doing running solo into a cage built by his enemies? There are easier ways to make money. Enemies." The word hung between them, tasting different in her voice than it did in coalition mouths. Less hatred, more an acknowledgement of a chapter not yet fully closed. "Enemies with good ports and better food than the frontier," Vale said. "Enemies whose credits spend just fine in the rest of the galaxy, if you know where to exchange them. And I've never been picky about who I trade with. War makes for interesting cargo." Used to, she said quietly. There it was again, that quiet. Not the brittle silence of trauma suppressed, but a weary acceptance of something vast. He watched her as she watched him. Behind him, somewhere beyond the walls, he sensed the vast complexity of the station, the bustle of the concourse, the relentless, patient workings of the chambers on the moon's surface. All of it framed by the ring he had just slipped through, a ring built in part by the same hands that now calmly held a mug of cooling drink. "You're not angry," he said, almost before he realized he'd chosen the words. Her eyebrows lifted. "Should I be?" "You've spent decades under siege," he said. "Locked behind guns pointed both out and in. I would expect more fury, more sound. For a species whose history with my employers is written in fire, this all feels peaceful." "We are angry," she said. "Some of us more than others. We have grief enough to drown stations. We used to shout about it, march with it, build more guns with it. But anger burns fast. After a while, you either let it consume you or you learn to channel it. We chose another path." "The bloom," he said, tasting the word. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but not in surprise. "You've heard it already. I suppose that's inevitable. We're not as secretive as we once were." She tapped a knuckle lightly on the desk. "Tell me what you think the bloom is." He let his shoulders lift. "Some new project," he said. "Some technology. The way people say it, there's reverence there. They talk about chambers like temples, far lights like shrines." He watched her closely. "Whatever it is, it stopped your raids." "We stopped our raids," she said evenly. "The bloom just gave us something else to do with our hands." He filed that line away. It had the ring of something she had said before, perhaps to herself, perhaps to others more willing to argue. "And what do you want with me?" he asked. "If I'm as dangerous as you say, why invite me into your house?" Now she did smile faintly. "Because danger recognizes danger," she said. "And because some parts of the bloom require materials and perspectives we don't easily get now that your coalition has so thoughtfully wrapped itself around our sun." She tilted her head. "We'd like you to run some quiet routes for us. No weapons, no sabotage, just transport. There are things we're building in places where your people still believe we are only licking our wounds. Things that need components moved, data carried, eyes that will notice if someone starts paying the wrong kind of attention." "And in return?" Vale asked, though he already knew the answer that would interest him. "In return," she said, "you get paid. You get protection, such as we can offer. You get access to markets that would otherwise be closed. And if your curiosity is as sharp as I think it is, you get a closer look at what we've been doing while you and yours have been watching for a war that isn't coming the way you expect." It was a neat hook. Any smuggler with a sense of profit and adventure would bite. Any spy would be unable to resist. "It sounds," Vale said slowly, "like a very elaborate way to say you want me to be a courier." "Sometimes the simplest words hide the most complex work," she replied. "Do you accept?" He let silence stretch, as if weighing risk against reward, as if his calculations did not already run in parallel through his trained mind. "Fine," he said at last. "I'll carry your packages, on one condition." Her eyebrows lifted again. "You're in a poor negotiating position, Cairo." "Maybe," he said, "but you want someone like me. So here's my price. I get to know, at least in broad strokes, what I'm hauling. No blind runs. I don't carry S-class biohazards, rogue AI seeds, or anything that's going to get me atomized on sight by a jumpy cruiser captain. I've had enough of being cargo my own self." "Reasonable," she said. "We don't deal in those things anyway." The last time we let an unsupervised S-class AI loose, the galaxy decided it didn't like us very much. Dry humor, but underneath an old ache. He thought of the Coalition's prohibition codes, the endless debates over the correct level of machine autonomy. He thought of human ships dancing with frightening grace in old battle footage, their actions too fluid for purely biological crews. Another shadow to add to the list. "All right then," he said. "Show me the goods." In time. She studied him for a heartbeat longer and then pushed her chair back. "Before I can trust you with the good runs, you need to understand something of the context you'd be operating in. You come from outside. You still think of us as you did when your coalition first slammed the ring shut and congratulated itself on saving civilization. That's not the whole picture anymore." He spread his hands. "I'm all ears." She glanced at his skull ridges as if hearing the faint slip in his idiom, but chose not to comment. "Come with me," she said, rising. "There's something you should see." He stood as she keyed a sequence into the wall panel. A section of the wall slid aside, revealing not another drab corridor, but a transparent lift shaft. Beyond its curved glass, the guts of the station stretched in a dizzying array: conduits, maintenance passages, pressure bulkheads. Above and below, he could see other lifts, other compartments. far below the arc of the moon's surface. They stepped into the capsule. It sealed behind them with a whisper. The floor gave a gentle lurch as it began to move, not out toward the concourse, but down through the station's belly, toward the gray dust and the humming towers he had glimpsed earlier. "Where are we going?" Vale asked, letting a thread of apprehension into his voice. A smuggler would not enjoy being taken blind into restricted zones. "Chamber 4, Myra Holt said, watching the levels slide past. "It's one of the smaller ones, but it's close and it will serve. Consider it your orientation." "The chambers are reactors," he guessed. "Power plants," she smiled faintly. "Don't insult our regular reactors, they'd be offended. No, the chambers are places where we talk to the universe in a slightly different register." She glanced at him. "You said you thought the bloom was a technology. It is, but it's also a choice. A way of living with what we've done, and with what was done to us." The lift slid through the station's lowest layers and into a shaft bored through Luna's crust. The glass darkened briefly as they passed through a radiation shielding band, then cleared. Rock and regolith slid by, illuminated by inset lights. The hum he had sensed earlier deepened, now clearly emanating from below. It was not quite sound. It vibrated in his bones, in the fluid of his inner ear, in the delicate membranes behind his eyes. "Does it bother you?" Myra asked, noticing the minute tightening of his jaw. "What is it?" he asked. "The bloom," she said simply. "Or at least one of its roots. Don't worry, you'll get used to it." "Your people speak of it as if it's alive," he said. She considered that. "In a sense," she replied, "but not in a way that threatens you, or us. Not if we're careful. We've had enough of living weapons. This is something else." Below them, the shaft opened into a vast cavern. The lift eased to a halt at a platform overlooking a great hollow carved into the moon's ancient rock. Vale stepped out beside Myra and felt the hum envelop him like a low, constant chord. The chamber stretched out before them. It was not like any reactor he had ever seen. He had expected a tangle of pipes and turbines, a core of seething plasma behind layers of shielding. Instead, the space was dominated by a structure that reminded him of a flower opening underground. Rings of slender pylons rose from the cavern floor, each tipped with a cluster of nodes that glowed with soft, shifting light. Between the pylons hung filaments of something that looked like woven light itself, threads that shimmered and braided and unbraided in patterns his eyes could not quite follow. They curved inward toward the center of the chamber, where a complex lattice of fields and structures formed a kind of spherical cage. Within that cage, something burned. At first, he thought it was simply an intense lamp, a fusion of beams. But no lamp he knew of had weight, or flicker, or the subtle granularity of a thing that was not merely emitting light, but consuming and producing it. It looked unmistakably like a tiny sun, a bead of radiant fire, its surface seething with miniature flares and dark specks that moved like spots on a star's photosphere. It was no bigger than a cargo pod, yet it pulsed with a brightness that made his eyes water even through whatever filters the platform's barrier field employed. Lines of force played across the air, visible where they bent dust motes and gas molecules into intricate currents. The woven light filaments fed into the cage, and from the cage emanated a subtle distortion that made the space around the tiny star waver, as if reality itself were being bent to cradle it. His mouth went dry. Instinct, training, and the simple, ingrained familiarity with physical laws he had never questioned all rose up in protest. Stars belonged out there in the deep, at the hearts of systems, not inside carved-out lunar caverns. Containing stellar material at that density, at that stability, at that scale, it shouldn't be possible. The Coalition's best physicists had never even suggested such a feat, except in the realm of thought experiments that always ended in catastrophic failure. What is that? He heard himself ask, his voice coming out softer than he intended. "An ember," Myra said quietly, "a pocket singularity of nuclear fire. A star, if you like, constrained in a lattice of fields we had to invent words for because old ones snapped under the strain." She watched him, not the thing. "We call them pocket stars. The chambers are where we grow them, tend them, use them." He took a step closer to the platform's railing, his eyes fixed on the tiny sun. Up close he could see more detail. The way its surface roiled in slow, deliberate currents, the way dark filaments dove and rose. Around it, in concentric shells, the air shimmered with temperature gradients artificially suppressed to keep the walls from vaporizing. Mechanical arms, delicate as spider legs, reached in and adjusted field nodes, their movements guided by algorithms too complex for his inner band to parse. "You're compressing stellar plasma," he said slowly, the analyst in him clawing for metaphors. holding it in braided gravitics, quantum tension nets. Even if you could form that, the energy output alone would power stations, she said, drive engines, farms, habitats, all of the above. The bloom started as a power project. After the war, we needed something to do with our minds besides weapons design. A shadow passed across her face, but it's turned into something more. When you learn how to plant stars like seeds, it changes how you think about cages. He watched a team of technicians at a console down on the chamber floor, their bodies silhouetted against glow. They moved with the unhurried assurance of gardeners rather than the twitchy wariness of bomb disposal experts. One laughed at something a colleague said, wiping sweat from her brow. Another stood with arms folded, head tilted, as if listening to music. Their faces, upturned briefly toward the tiny sun, were lit in hues that made them seem almost otherworldly. "You did this under blockade," he said. "With your fleets penned in, with your empire cut off." "With our fleets pulled back, yes," she said. "With our empire, that was always more veneer than substance. Once the gates crashed and the ring closed, we had to face what we were. A species that had spent a century learning how to break other people's toys." Her gaze remained on the pocket star. "We were very good at it, too good. So the question became, if we weren't going to be allowed to roam anymore, what could we build in one place that would be worth the cost of what we'd done? And this is your answer?" he asked. "Pocket stars? This is one face of it." She turned to him then, really looking, and he felt again that sense of being measured down to his bones. "You asked why we're so calm, why we're not hurling ourselves at your ring, screaming for the freedom we think we deserve. It's because we found something else to scream at, the universe, its boundaries, its smug laws." A faint, wry smile touched her lips. "If we're going to rage, we'd rather do it by bending physics in new ways than by throwing more soldiers at a wall." He swallowed. Somewhere, far behind his carefully neutral face, a part of him responded to that sentiment with a dangerous flicker of admiration. "You understand why your coalition is afraid of us," she said softly. "Even more so now. A species that goes quiet is frightening. A species that goes quiet and starts growing suns in its basements," she shrugged. "If I were them, I'd be worried too." He could not deny it. The pocket star pulsed, and the hum in his chest seemed to sync with it for a heartbeat, as if some tiny part of him had fallen into its gravity. "What happens," he asked quietly, "if one of those gets loose?" "We don't let them," she said. There was no arrogance in it, just firm conviction. "We've had close calls. Early on, learned our limits the hard way. Some of our scars are buried deep under regolith, but we're not children with matches anymore. We've built checks on checks, systems that will snap the lattice and let the ember wink out rather than let it grow unchecked. We are, if nothing else, highly motivated." Her gaze slid toward him, and for the first time he saw real steel in it. "We know what happens when we let our creations run away with us." He thought of old stories of human AIs, of fleets commanded by minds that existed in no single skull, of entire sectors evacuated when a war machine became too enthusiastic. The coalition had used those stories as justification to clamp down on their own machine systems, to outlaw certain experiments, to paint humans as reckless progenitors of monsters. "And the bloom?" he asked. "You call this the bloom. This is one of the seeds. The bloom is. What happens when you plant enough of them in the right patterns?" Her expression softened, some private thought touching it. "New habitats dug into cold worlds that never saw more than a thin frost and a dim sun, farms under rocks where no atmosphere ever formed, drives that let our ship slip through folds in space more gracefully, and something else, something farther out." She nodded subtly toward the far wall of the chamber, where a long tunnel mouth yawned, leading deeper into the moon. Above it, a sign glowed with a symbol like a star circled by petals. "The Far Lights." "One of your people in the concourse said his brother was posted at Far Light 7, Vale said. "He said he hasn't seen a sky in 2 years and doesn't miss it." Mira's lips curved. "Far Light 7 is not somewhere that encourages looking back," she said. "You see, Cairo, when someone cages us, our instinct isn't to sit complacently. It's to start digging. Your coalition built a ring around Saul to keep us in. We took that as a challenge. If we can't go out the way we used to, we'll find another path. Maybe not through your ring, maybe not through your space at all." Her voice had Tolkien's patient weight now, simple and implacable. "Maybe through the universe itself." The hair along Vale's arms prickled. "You're leaving?" he said. "How?" "The coalition monitors all known gate activity. The interdiction protocols are very good at watching the doors they know about," she said. "Not so good at noticing when someone starts building a tunnel underneath the foundations." She studied the small sun, its tiny flares playing across her face. "We're not there yet. The far lights are prototypes. Paths we're exploring. They may fail. They may lead nowhere. They may kill us. But we're trying, because sitting quietly in a cage built by people who fear us is not sustainable. She looked back at him. And because some part of us still believes we're meant for more than being a warning tale. He thought of the coalition's council chamber, of the earnest fear in the counselor's eyes. He thought of the ring behind him, of its patient guns. He thought of this woman, calm and weary, standing watch over a tiny, impossible star in a hollowed rock. The narrative he had carried with him, that the humans had been cowed, broken, their energies turned inward into mere survival, felt thin in the face of this. "You invited me," he said slowly, "to run errands in this bloom, to carry pieces of whatever it is you're building. Why trust an outsider with that? Why trust someone you don't truly know?" "Because we watch as well as dig," she said. "Because we've had eyes on you since before your ship touched the debris river. You think we don't notice when a smuggler we haven't seen in nearly 2 years shows up with hull mods that scream of coalition yard work? You think we don't have our own agents listening in the same corners yours do?" Her gaze sharpened. "You came here to spy, Veilkir, son of Ketharin. You wear your stolen skin well, but not perfectly." For the first time since he'd stepped out of the coalition briefing room, his heart stumbled. The instinct to reach for the hidden knife under his sleeve flared and was beaten back by cooler discipline. His face remained carefully arranged, but he knew something had flickered there, surprise, a crack. "I don't know that name," he said. It was a weak objection, even to his own ears. She did not smile this time. "We burned your world," she said quietly. "You think we didn't keep track of the boys who stood on the walls and watched us come? You think our historians haven't cross-referenced every piece of data we could get on the agents the coalition sends to peer through our bars?" There was no triumph in her tone, only a sad inevitability. "We know who you are, not everything, not your dreams." "But enough. Then why am I not in a cell?" he asked, his voice very level now. "Because cages don't suit us," she said simply. "And because, for all your coalition's fear, you came here alone. That tells me 2 things. They trust you and they expect you to die if necessary without fuss. I don't like the second part. I'm tired of people being sent to die in other people's stories." She nodded toward the pocket star. "We're writing a different one down here." He stared at her, at the tiny sun, at the woven light. The scenario models back in the coalition's covert branch had never fully considered this, that the humans might not only know he was coming, but let him walk into their heart anyway. "What do you want from me?" he asked at last. There was no bluff in it now, only the question of a man who had found the ground under him not quite where he thought it was. "Honesty," she said. "As much as you can manage given who you work for, and your eyes. Your understanding." She leaned on the railing, the lines of her face softening. "You came here to find out why we stopped fighting, to report back whether we're a threat readying for a new war or a spent force. I can tell you right now, we are not done, but the war we're preparing for isn't with you, not directly." "Then with whom?" he asked. She shook her head slightly. "That's a conversation for another day. For now, I want you to see, to walk in our stations, talk to our people, feel the hum of the chambers. To understand that the quiet you fear isn't the quiet of extinction, it's the quiet of growth, of roots digging down, of a bloom you haven't yet seen the petals of." He thought of the coalition's great ships, of their careful patrols, of the ring's ancient-seeming strength. He thought of the fear that had driven them to pen the humans in. He thought of how that fear would spike if he told them about this little star. "You're asking me," he said slowly, "to spy on my own employers for you." "I'm asking you," she replied, "to learn the truth and then decide what to do with it. You're not a child, Veilkir. You've seen enough war to know that the stories we're handed about each other are incomplete. You're here now, you've seen one chamber, that already changes things. There is no going back to ignorance." He looked down at his hands on the railing, the gray skin, the subtle ridges of his bones. In the glow of the pocket star, they looked almost human. "What if I tell them everything?" he asked. "What if I go back and say, they're building new suns in their caves, they're digging under our walls, they're planning paths we can't see?" "Then your coalition will do what it always does when confronted with something it fears," she said quietly. "It will debate. It will bluster. It will maybe send more ships. And it will not understand, not fully, because it still thinks in terms of walls and bars." She looked at him, the gray of her eyes storm-soft. "We're not planning to fight our way out through your ring veil. We're planning to grow around it, to slip our roots into places your guns can't reach. You can't shoot what you can't see, and you can't contain what's no longer in the cage you built." He exhaled. The hum of the chamber filled the spaces between their words. "And me," he said. "Where do I fit in your bloom?" "That depends on you," she said. "You can remain what you came here as, a spy feeding reports back to a council that will probably use them to justify rebuilding old walls thicker. Or you can also be something else, a witness, a courier not just of component manifests and field data, but of understanding, between us and them. She smiled then, small and tired but genuine. It's a dangerous place to stand. But then, so is every place worth standing, in my experience. His training told him this was the moment to hedge, to keep options open, to say something that neither committed nor refused. His instincts, older and harder to program, told him he was standing on the edge of something that would rewrite the shape of his life whether he agreed to it or not. He looked at her at the chamber, at the little impossible sun. "Why me?" he asked, one last time, not as an agent, but as the boy who had once stood on a wall watching human ships descend. She seemed to hear that shift, her gaze softened. "Because you're here," she said simply. "Because you came to the cage not with a gun, but with questions. Because whether you admit it or not, you've been reading our stories, listening to our songs, carrying them with you like contraband in a pocket no one else can see. That kind of curiosity is rare, even among my own." She turned toward the lift, then paused, looking back over her shoulder. The tiny star's light traced a faint halo around her profile. "Besides," she added, voice gentler now with a simple plainness, "it's lonely sometimes at the edge of a new thing. Having someone from the outside who can see it with fresh eyes helps." She studied him for a heartbeat longer, then nodded toward the depths of the chamber. "We've been living down here with our little sons and our big ideas for a while now, Valkyr. We've grown used to them, maybe too used." Her lips curved slightly. "Do you want to see where we've been living?" For a heartbeat he said nothing, caught between the reflex to refuse anything he did not understand, and the old, stubborn impulse that had made him follow human stories across light years, even when his own people told him they were poison. The little sun burned before them, caged and humming. In its pale wash, Myra's face looked carved from some gray, patient stone. "Yes," Vale said. Her nod was small, as if she had expected nothing else, as if his agreement were only the last link in a chain laid down long ago. She turned from the railing and keyed a command into a recessed panel. Across the chamber, a section of the far wall, a darker band beneath the hanging filaments, slid aside with geological slowness, revealing the mouth of another tunnel. This one was different from the neat shafts they had ridden in. Its edges were rougher, lined with older rock, and there were veins of some darker material shot through the lunar regolith like frozen rivers. "The chambers of Genesis are deeper," Myra said, gesturing him toward the lift that awaited them on the platform's edge. "Older. We built these under the war and kept them quiet even from some of our own. The public chambers, like this one, grew out of them later. What we do here is less showpiece, more roots. If you're going to carry our work in your hull, you should know what its roots look like." "You're very free with your secrets," Vale said as the lift's doors closed around them. The capsule shuddered, then detached from the platform with a soft lurch, beginning a slow descent into the newly opened tunnel. "For a woman who just told me, she knows I'm a spy." Mira leaned her shoulder against the transparent wall, watching the rock slide past. "Looked older here somehow, the layers tighter and more twisted. People who think in walls assume that knowledge is a thing you can lock away," she said. "People who think in roots know that some truths spread whether you like it or not. I can't stop the fact that you've already seen one chamber. I can only decide what shape the story takes in your head." "You're shaping me," he said. "I'm giving you context," she answered. "What your coalition does with that, that's on them. And on you." The lift sank farther. The hum in the bones of the station deepened into something that felt less like machinery and more like a slow, patient strain. Vale's inner ear registered tiny oscillations in gravity, as if the very pull of the moon were being braided and unbraided in subtle patterns. It made the hair on his arms rise. "What you're feeling," Myra said quietly, eyes still on the rock, "is space-time complaining. We're asking it to do things it was never meant to do in a place like this. The math says it's fine. The instincts took longer to convince." "It feels," Vale said, choosing his words slowly, "like the groan of a world turning in its sleep, as if you've nudged it onto the edge of waking." "That's a poet's description," she said. "I like it better than the engineer's version. They say we're dragging curvature gradients around like nets through a sea. Personally, I grew up near fault lines. It feels to me like standing on the ground while tectonic plates settle into a new configuration." "You were not afraid to disturb them?" "Oh, we were terrified," she said. "But fear and necessity have never been particularly good at staying in their lanes with us. We needed power. We needed space. We needed somewhere for our minds to go when the physical bars of your ring closed around us. So we dug, and we bent things we didn't fully understand, and we learned, or we died." Often both. The tunnel widened. The rock fell away on one side of the lift, revealing an immense hollow whose scale made the chamber they had left behind seem almost modest. The lift glided into an open shaft that crossed the void and then slowed, easing toward a platform built like a balcony jutting from the cavern wall. Vale's breath caught despite himself. The chambers of Genesis were not one thing, but many. A cluster of enormous, overlapping spaces like bubbles frozen mid-merge, their boundaries traced in faintly glowing lattices that hung in the air like spider silk spun from starlight. In each enclosed volume, a different light burned. Some were soft and diffuse, like foggy dawns. Some were sharp and white, casting hard-edged shadows. Some were tinted in colors he had no name for. The hum that filled the air here was deeper, layered, a chorus of spacetime's strained complaint. Within each chamber, at its heart, a pocket star hung, suspended in its own web of fields. Around some, nothing else was visible but instruments and field generators, austere labs of pure physics. Around others, structures nestled. Rings, shells, tiny arcologies like beads threaded along invisible lines. And in the spaces between these larger hollows, in the interstitial rock, conduits ran like roots, carrying energy and information between the different pockets. Vale stepped off the lift onto the balcony, feeling the gravity shift under his feet with the minor mood swings of tortured spacetime. A safety field shimmered at the edge, keeping the raw forces below from licking up and flensing them. Myra stood beside him, hands in her jacket pockets, shoulders loose in a way that spoke of familiarity with this impossible vista. "These are the first," she said, "the ones we cut when the war was still hot. We were afraid your ships would land on us any day. We built weapons here at first because we didn't know how to build anything else with this much power. Then the ring closed and the war went sideways. We had time we didn't expect." Her gaze drifted across the cluster of glowing hollows. "We repurposed." Below them and to the left, a smaller chamber drew Vale's attention. It was maybe a few hundred meters across, not large by the standards of these caverns, but big enough to be a world if your frame of reference shrank. Its walls were a shimmering, translucent haze that bent light in odd ways, like heat ripples over stone. At its center hung what looked, at first glance, like a cluster of beads on strings. Then his depth perception recalibrated, and he saw that each bead was a tiny sun, and the strings were not strings but curved paths in a carefully tuned gravitational manifold. "That one," Myra said, following his gaze, "is what you might call an orchard." He heard the word, but his mind temporarily refused its application. "An orchard? We plant stars like seeds," she said. "We're very literal with our metaphors some days. Those are embryo stars, protoembers. Each is a different mass, composition, rotational rate. We tweak them, watch them, coax them. Some we let grow into full pocket stars, some we fuse into others. Some we starve and see what happens when they try to die. It's our test bed." "And we used to consider you merely inventive," Vale murmured. "This is obscenity and beauty in one breath." "You get used to the obscene," Myra said. "We've done much worse to living things." She gestured, and a portion of the balcony's railing dissolved into a ramp that led down along the cavern wall, toward a lower catwalk that would bring them closer to the orchard. "Come on, you'll see better up close." They walked along the ramp, the hum deepening as they descended. As they drew nearer, Vale saw that each tiny sun in the orchard was held in its own lattice of forces, a miniature of the cage that had held the pocket star in Chamber 4. Around some, faint halos glowed where gas had been introduced to see how it behaved in that intense, tiny gravity. Around others, delicate structures orbited, tiny rings no bigger than his torso, laden with sensors. "Each of those is small enough that its local curvature doesn't tear the larger chamber apart," Myra said, "but big enough that, with the right manipulations, you can create interesting topologies around them. Little knots of space. We started by folding and refolding the space around a single ember. Then we realized we could pinch off parts of that fold entirely." "Pinch off," he repeated. "As in, cut from this space. As in, create a separate region of spacetime with its own interior geometry," she said. "Still anchored to ours at certain boundary conditions, but self-contained enough that what happens inside doesn't immediately spill out." She smiled without humor. "Our early attempts at pocket universes blew up in very dramatic ways. It took us a while to figure out how to keep the baby bubbles from collapsing or eating each other. We lost a lot of rock learning." "And people?" he asked quietly. She did not answer immediately. "We lost a lot of rock," she said again, "and some things we can't name cleanly anymore." She stopped at a viewing blister that bulged slightly out over the orchard. The transparent pane before them showed magnified views as they willed it, one tiny sun swelling and shrinking, another shedding a halo of plasma like a shedding snake's skin, a third surrounded by a faint glitter that resolved, at higher magnification, into dust grains forming the very beginnings of a disk. Resource scarcity, she said, as if picking up a lecture she had given many times. That was the lever your coalition used to justify the blockade. Humans are dangerous because they don't know when to stop taking. They will strip worlds bare, eat their way through asteroid belts, choke their own skies with waste. And they did. We did. You weren't wrong. She nodded toward the orchard. But what happens when you give a species like ours the ability to grow its own raw material, to build closed loops of matter and energy that don't depend on stripping new systems? You cheat, Vale said softly. You step sideways out of the old economy. We try, she said. We still mine, we still dig. But we're not as hungry outwardly because so much of our hunger has turned inward. Into places like this, like the pockets, like the bloom. We compress matter, cook it, recycle it. We seed tiny universes with starting conditions favorable to fast and abundant synthesis of what we need. Heavy elements, exotic phases of matter, fields we can harvest. We burst our own little supernovae and scoop up the ashes. He watched as one bead in the orchard brightened, swelled, then winked out in a carefully managed microexplosion. Its cage flared, momentarily strained, then absorbed and radiated the release in directed channels that flowed into a set of collector nodes. Where the tiny star had been, a cloud of debris remained, its particle traces glowing in diagnostic overlays. Automated arms moved in, sifting, sorting, capturing. That one just provided enough rare heavy nuclei to build 1,000,000 kilometers of high-grade transmission line, Myra said. Or 1,000 ship drives, or 10,000 hospital machines, or a lot of art, depends on what we choose to do with it. Just like picking fruit, Vale murmured, the analogy was unsettling. Fruit did not explode when harvested, fruit did not warp gravity. And yet, the rhythm of it, the cycle of seeding, tending, harvest, and regrowth, felt disturbingly organic. They moved on along the catwalk, leaving the orchard behind. Ahead, another chamber yawned, its interior shield tuned to a different transparency. Inside, instead of bare stars or naked physics experiments, there floated structures at a scale that made Vale blink in confusion. At first, it looked like a faintly luminous fog speckled with darker motes. Then his eyes adjusted to the scale presented by the overlays, and he realized he was looking at an entire ecosystem compressed into a space the size of a small city. A tiny sun hung off to one side of this pocket, its light filtered through layers of engineered atmosphere into soft, diffuse day. Below it, landmasses rose and fell like the knotted backs of sleeping animals, miniature continents of rock and soil, some no larger than barges, some broad enough that a walker could go days inside without hitting their edges. Water traced glittering threads between them, pooling in lakes that would have fit comfortably inside one of Luna's older craters, falling in threads that, by magnification, were waterfalls. And life moved there. His band whispered the analyses as his eyes struggled to keep up. Plant analogs spreading sheets of color from ultraviolet to near-infrared, their leaves unfurling and furling in accelerated cycles. Small, quick things that darted from branch to branch, tongues flicking, limbs elongated, shapes adapted to a gravity slightly different from Sol's. Larger shapes that lumbered or glided, their bodies designed by human hands but left to evolve under pressures that were now their own. It runs faster in there, Myra said quietly. Time, I mean. We can tune it within limits. This one is running at about 100-year cycle to our one. It's not perfect relativity, more like tricking the metric so that processes inside experience different effective rates. But the result is accelerated ecology. Why? He heard the hoarseness in his own voice. Why build that? Because we needed somewhere to learn how to live without stripping every world we touched, she said. We started with bacteria, simple plants. Chewed through dozens of runs before we got a stable loop. Then we added complexity, step by step. It's one thing to model a closed ecosystem on a simulation. It's another to watch one actually work through 1,000,000 subjective years under your own tiny sun and see where the cracks widen. Her eyes were on the pocket ecosystem, and there was a tenderness there he had not seen when she watched the pocket star above. We learned humility, and a few tricks. A flock of something like birds, but not birds, took flight across his field of view, their wings not quite planar, their motions exploiting currents in the tuned air that his instincts could not parse. In the undergrowth beneath, something predator-shaped moved, then stilled, waiting. The whole pocket was alive with interactions, with births and deaths and the slow, complex dance of adaptation. "You play gods," he said. "We play gardeners," she corrected softly. "When we started, some of us wanted to play gods. They burned. Their worlds died. We learned to be smaller than that, to accept that these pockets will never be perfect, that they will contain suffering and randomness no matter what we do. But we can at least try to shape them so that they don't collapse under the weight of our mistakes. And the time?" He tore his gaze from a tiny herbivore making its careful way along a branch. 100 of your years to one of ours. You can compress entire evolutionary experiments into the span of a blockade. Or entire cultures, she said. "Come on, there's something else I need to show you." They left the accelerated ecosystem chamber and crossed a bridge that spanned a dizzying drop into one of the deeper hollows. The farther they went, the more the hum of warped spacetime wove with another sound, faint, disjointed, like distant voices heard through walls. At first Vale thought it was merely the murmuring of engineers working in other chambers, filtered through the rock. Then the voices sharpened, laughter, sobbing, songs that cut across his band's capacity to categorize. Mira led him to a control room carved into the rock above a cluster of smaller pockets. Consoles lined the walls, their surfaces alive with shifting displays. In the air before them hung screens of light, windows looking into other worlds. Each screen showed a different scene. A cityscape under a violet sky, its towers grown rather than built, curved and organic, threaded with bridges and lit from within by bioluminescent webs. A wide plain under a red-orange sun, where people in loose robes walked among tall constructs of glass and metal that rearranged themselves slowly as if alive. A cramped interior filled with books and hanging fabrics, where an old woman sat telling a story to a group of children whose eyes were wider and darker than any he had seen before. "These are..." He trailed off. "Pocket realms," Myra said. "Micro-universes, some are no bigger than small countries, some the size of entire planets if you live inside their metrics. We seeded them with matter, with a star, with physics tweaked just enough to suit their purpose. Then we went inside." He stared. "Inside. Not physically," she said. "Not at first. We didn't know how to pull that off safely. We still barely do in some cases." Her fingers moved across one console, bringing one of the windows closer. It showed a street in that violet sky city, where people walked past stalls selling things that glowed and pulsed, where music came not just from instruments but from the very stones, vibrating in harmony with the footfalls. We went in with our minds. Interfaces, neural bridges. You'd call them simulations, but that word implies an unreality that doesn't quite fit. "These places are real, in the sense that they have mass, energy, causality. We just learned how to map our cognitive patterns onto residents there, so that time could pass for us in ways your ring could not touch." On one screen, a child took his first steps, wobbling toward arms held out in encouragement. On another, a funeral procession wound through a canyon, the mourners, faces painted in intricate patterns that shifted as they moved. On a third, people danced in a place with no clear gravity, their bodies moving through a space that folded and unfolded in response. Vale's throat tightened. "How long have these been running?" "The oldest?" She tapped another screen, bringing up a view of an old man sitting on a porch that overlooked a sea of something like glass. Stars hung overhead, crowded and bright. The man's face was deeply lined, his hair silver, his hands steady as they held a carved instrument. "Subjective time inside is approaching 50,000 years. Out here, that chamber's been active for 20, give or take. Different pockets run at different rates, some are faster, some slower. We learn to tune them based on what they're for." "And what are they for?" he asked, barely able to pull his eyes from the scenes. "Escapism, refuge, experiments." "All of that," she said. "We were trapped. Our bodies, our ships, our economies. Your ring put hard limits on where our flesh and steel could go. But our minds, those were never going to accept that easily. We would have torn ourselves apart with frustration and resentment. So we built halls to wander in, worlds to live in, places where we could keep changing, keep telling stories, keep making terrible and beautiful things, even if our physical coordinates never changed." She zoomed in on another window. It showed a classroom, but not like any he had seen. The walls were transparent to a swirling cosmos outside, where equations hung like constellations. The teacher, if that was the right term, was less a single figure than a shifting structure of light, aligning itself to the questions of the students whose bodies were only marginally human. "We call some of them heirlooms," she said. Long-duration pockets where we let entire cultures bloom. Different parameters, different initial conditions. Some are guided, some almost completely free. We keep records. We learn from what they try and what they break. It's staggering, sometimes, the weight of it. Entire civilizations, born, flourishing, failing in a space smaller than this station, under a sun you can hold in your hand if you're reckless enough. And the people inside, his mind struggled with the implication. They're copies of you? Some are, Myra said. Some are their own. Sometimes we seed a pocket with a founding cohort of mapped consciousnesses, volunteers who know they'll live there, maybe for generations of perceived time, building something new. Their bodies outside go into support care. We keep them alive as long as we can. When their outside bodies fail, we can sometimes stabilize the inside pattern, keep it running in the pocket. Sometimes not. The ethics are complicated. A muscle jumped in her jaw. Other pockets we let emerge from simpler agents. We set ground rules and see what kind of minds evolve. Those are harder to look at sometimes. They don't have the same anchor back to us. He watched a woman in one of the screens, her hair a shock of blue in a world of muted earth tones, stand on a hill and shout something wordless at the sky. The sky responded, colors rippling across it like an aurora that answered prayer. Children laughed and tried it themselves. The world flexed slightly, indulging them. You built universes, he said, the word tasting like dust. You live and die in them. You have an empire our ring cannot touch because it's folded under your own feet. That's one way to see it, Myra said. Empire feels wrong to me. The old kind of empire was about lines on maps and flags planted in foreign dirt. This is interior. It doesn't consume anything that didn't start from our own mass and energy budgets. It doesn't require subjected peoples. It's a civilization inside a civilization, a way to keep moving even when the outside says no. And the price? He asked. You said the purpose without explaining the price. She was silent for a long time. On the screens, people lived entire scenes while they stood there. Arguments, confessions, quiet cups of something steaming on balconies overlooking alien seas. A child fell, skinned a knee, cried, was comforted. A ship sailed off the edge of a waterfall that then folded itself into a loop so that the ship emerged from its own wake. The price, Myra said at last, is that some of us do not come back, some because their bodies fail, some because they don't want to. Her fingers moved over a control and one window expanded. It showed a room lit by a sun that hovered just above the ceiling, like a benevolent lamp. A woman lay in a bed, her hair thin, skin translucent over bones. Tubes ran from her arms to machines. Monitors displayed vital signs that wavered dangerously. Beside her sat another woman holding her hand. But the second woman's body flickered slightly, an artifact of transmission. Around her, the walls occasionally bled through with glimpses of another place. The violet city, the glass sea, a forest of crystal. She was there and not there at once. That's my mother, Myra said. Her voice was flat, but the space around it felt raw. Her body is in a hospice ring above Earth. Her mind spends most of its time in one of the heirloom pockets. She comes back sometimes when we ask her to, or when she remembers she has a daughter who still lives mostly out here. Every time she returns, she is older inside than I am. She has grandchildren I've never met, lifetimes in structures I've only visited as code. Her outside body is 83. Her inside self has seen 500 years. On the screen, the flickering projection of the mother squeezed the hand of her own frail hand, and a strange double loop of comfort closed. Body assuring mind, mind soothing body. The expression on her face was not joy, not sorrow, but something dense and layered that Vale knew his own people did not yet have a word for. She says she is happy, Myra went on. She says the pockets have given her more life than she ever expected. But I watch her forget whether a memory happened under a real sky or an invented one. I watch her speak of wars I know never happened here, only in the pockets. I watch her cry for people who never had bodies in this universe. The price is confusion, entanglement, sometimes horror. When a pocket crashes, and they do, despite our best efforts, we lose whole histories in a blink. We try to back them up. It's never enough. He looked at her. Why do you keep doing it? Because the alternative was to stagnate, she said. To pace in our cage until we tore each other apart. Because for every pocket that fails, a dozen flourish and teach us things we never could have learned otherwise. Because when you see a poet whose entire tradition developed under a sun the size of an aircar write something that moves you to tears, it's hard to argue that they shouldn't exist. She met his gaze. Because we are very bad at choosing not to reach Valkyr. It's what got us into this mess. It's also what got us out of dying quietly behind your ring." He turned away from the screens, his mind buzzing with images that would not settle. A civilization inside a civilization. Generations living out lives in spaces grown from human hands, human math. Empires made of thought, seated in cavities in a moon chewed hollow by war. He expected the fear that rose in him. What he did not expect was the awe. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking a sea that went on forever in all directions, knowing that if he stepped he might drown, but also that the air above it smelled unlike anything he had known. He was about to ask another question when he saw it. Between two of the screens showing pocket realms, there was a sliver of darkness. Not the absence of a display, not a gap in the array, but a shape like a vertical smear where light did not quite behave. It was small, the size of his hand at arm's length, and at first he thought it was a trick of his eyes after staring too long. But as he watched, it moved. Not with the casual drift of dust or the deliberate motion of a projected image, but with the unsettling, halting grace of something that did not fully belong in their geometry. It slid along the edges of the screens, never fully intruding into any of the windows, never fully retreating into the rock. Where it passed, the colors in the pocket images dimmed slightly, as if the thing drank them. A child's laughter in one window stuttered like a transmission hitting static, then resumed. The shape paused there for a heartbeat, then slipped on. "What is that?" Vale asked quietly. Mira's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. She did not look at the dark smear. Her fingers moved across a console, shifting some display. "Artifacts," she said. "Interference in the fields. We get them sometimes when multiple pockets are cycling in phase." "That's not interference," he said. Years of living in the shadows of intelligence work made his voice sharper than he intended. "That's something. It's not a shadow. It's an absence. It moved." "Absence moves," she said, still not looking. "Don't romanticize it." The dark sliver slipped along another boundary, elongating, then contracting. For a moment it seemed to tilt, as if considering them. Vale felt a pressure behind his eyes, a sensation like being on the verge of remembering a word in a language he had never learned. He stepped involuntarily toward the screens, hand lifting. The absence flinched away. No, that was the wrong word. It simply was less where his hand reached, like fog avoiding heat, or a hole in a world quietly adjusting to a new contour. "What are they?" he whispered. "Truly." Mira's hand closed around his wrist, her grip unexpectedly strong. "Don't poke," she said. Her voice carried, for the first time, a thin thread of something like fear. "They notice pulling on the edges. We monitor them, we do not prod them." "They?" he echoed. "There are more." "Of course there are more," she said. "You can't carve dozens of little universes in the underbelly of a gravity well without residue, boundaries, places where the math frays." She released his wrist and stepped between him and the screens, breaking his line of sight. "We call them between things." It's not an accurate term, but it's better than some of the older names. Those got superstitious. He glanced past her shoulder. The dark smear was gone, or perhaps his mind refused to fix it anymore. "You're afraid of them," he said. "I'm cautious around them," she corrected. "Fear is for things you can run from. These we live with. They come, they go. So far, they don't pry too hard. Mostly they watch." "What are they watching?" The question felt very small in his mouth. "Us, the pockets, everything." She rubbed a thumb along the edge of the console, an old habit perhaps. When you make a hole in a wall, sometimes what's on the other side gets curious. The bloom didn't just give us new rooms to walk into, Vale. It put windows in places that never had them. Her eyes, when she met his, had a shadow now that the pocket suns could not wash out. "We like to tell ourselves we're the only ones looking through. But you don't believe that," he said. "I've spent too long down here listening to the groan of spacetime to believe we're the only ones paying attention," she answered. "There are anomalies we can't make fit our equations, glitches on the boundaries, patterns that look an awful lot like responses. We argue about them. Some say it's just the system settling. Some say it's emergent behavior from the pockets themselves. Some think there's something else in the interstices learning us." She shrugged, a brittle motion. "We keep going anyway. Because we don't know how to stop." He thought of the coalition's fear, of the ring, of how small, suddenly, their guns felt stacked against this quiet madness. "Your people," he said, "your minds, your culture, they've spent decades living in these pockets under these suns, watched by between things. You're not the same ones we fought." She laughed softly. "No," she said, "we're not. How could we be? My grandparents lived their entire lives under the shadow of war. My parents straddled it, one foot in the battles, one in the first chambers. I've spent more time in metric-tuned spaces than under an open, unmodified sky. We've had time to fold and refold ourselves in little universes you don't even know exist. Our art, our science, our faiths, they've gone places no blockade could ever anticipate. Faith, he echoed. You carry religions into these pockets. We carry everything into them, she said. We don't know how not to. Some pockets are explicitly spiritual realms, temples grown into universes where contemplating a single equation can take a lifetime because time is tuned that way. Others are aggressively secular, locked down so only economic experiments run inside. Doesn't seem to matter. People bring wonder with them. They invent new gods, or new ways of saying there are none. They come back with eyes full of places no one else has seen. She spread her hands slightly. Have you looked into the eyes of one of your own who spent decades undercover, Vale? The way they carry lives they can't talk about. Multiply that by thousands, by pocket lifetimes, by universes. That's us now. He remembered agents who had come back from long assignments hollowed out or filled to the brim with unshareable stories. He imagined that multiplied, scaled up to entire populations. He understood, suddenly, the strange calm of the station concourse, the deep patience in Myra's face. These were people who had watched their own deaths from other vantage points, who had lived in cities that fit inside a moon. The coalition had confined their flesh and ships. It had not confined their minds. If anything, it had forced them to turn inward and discover new infinities there. He felt the first real crack open in his allegiance, and it terrified him. Not because he was about to turn traitor, not yet, but because he realized he no longer stood firmly on one side of the story. He had one foot on each of two drifting ice floes, and the water between them was widening. You expected barbarians, Myra said softly, reading something in his face. Raiders, wolves we had to chain. That's still who we are to your council, isn't it? Dangerous animals safely caged. I expected desperate people, he said. Half-starved, half-mad, clawing at the bars. I expected war fleets being built from scrap in dark slips, screaming for revenge. I did not expect orchards of stars. Tiny universes. Grandmothers who have seen 500 years and cry for people who never had flesh. I did not expect the between things. Her mouth quirked. We have war fleets too, she said. We're not saints, there are always some building weapons. We just make them differently now, and uses for them that don't always involve other species' cities. He swallowed. I don't know whether to be relieved or more afraid. Both is a reasonable reaction, she said. It's how most of us live. He turned back to the screens one more time. The dark smear did not reappear. Inside the pockets, life went on at whatever subjective pace each universe allowed. Children grew, lovers parted and met again, scientists scribbled equations in air that rippled in response, priests or poets, or something between the two whispered to tiny suns floating above their palms. A civilization within a civilization, watched by things that were not quite there. How do you sleep? He asked quietly, knowing all this churns under your feet. Sometimes we don't, she said. Sometimes we dream of wars that never happened or deaths that haven't occurred yet if they ever will. Sometimes we wake up convinced we're still in a pocket and that this is the simulation. Sometimes we walk to places like this and remind ourselves that the rock is still rock, that gravity still pulls, that there is still a real sky outside the ring. Other times. She looked down toward another chamber, where a handful of engineers moved like ants along a rail, adjusting something near a pocket star. Other times we tell ourselves that if there are horrors here, they are at least ours, that we chose them. He did not press when she said horrors. The between things were enough for one day. They left the control room and its windows into condensed infinities. Down another ramp, through a narrow passage where the rock had been glassed by some ancient miscalculation, into a service gallery that overlooked one of the older chambers. Here, there were fewer lights, fewer technicians. The pale gleam of the central pocket star was dimmer, its surface less smooth. Around it, the lattice of its cage was thicker, cruder, the lines of force less elegantly braided. This was one of the first, Vale realized, one of the prototypes. We don't use this one much anymore, Myra said. Too unstable for heavy loads, too temperamental for long-duration pockets, but it's useful for testing safety systems, failure modes. Failure modes, he repeated. You mean you break it on purpose? We poke at its boundaries under controlled conditions, she said. Better to learn on an old, cranky ember than risk a newer one. This star has survived more insults than most species. There was something like affection in her tone. We call it Lamed, after an old letter. It stood in the alphabet of the bloom since the beginning. Below them, a small team worked at a console set into the chamber wall. Their voices drifted up, muted. Data scrolled across their screens in colors Vale's band rendered as meaningless for him but rich with content for them. The hum here was rougher, with occasional stutters that made his teeth ache. He leaned on the railing, watching the old pocket star. As he did, it flickered. It was subtle at first, a tiny hiccup in its steady output. The filament lattice around it flared, compensating. Lines of force shifted. The technicians below glanced up, frowning, then back at their readings. Myra's hand tightened on the rail. "Is that normal?" Vale asked. "Lamed grumbles," she said. "Like an old boiler. We give it leeway." The star flickered again, harder. This time the light dimmed noticeably, then surged back, overshooting its previous brightness. The hum in the chamber spiked in pitch, a thin keen overlaying the baseline groan. One of the technicians swore, the word clear even at this distance. Another began tapping frantically at the console. "Field coherence is dropping," Myra murmured. Her voice had shifted, the easy calm giving way to clipped assessment. "That's faster than it should fade." Below, warning lights flared along the chamber's perimeter. Around the pocket star, the woven light filaments that held it in place trembled like strings under too much tension. Vale saw tiny arcs of discharges, miniature flares, lick outward and clang against the lattice. The star's surface seethed. It was not simply burning hotter, it was changing. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means a phase transition in the core," she said tightly. "Too sudden, not part of the test profile." She reached up and tapped the implant at her temple, connecting to the chamber's systems directly. Her pupils dilated. "We're getting a metric shear spike, something S pushing at the boundary from the inside." "From the inside," he echoed. "One of your pockets." "There's only one pocket nested in Lamed right now," she muttered, half to herself. "A dry one, no sentience, it's not enough mass to dam it." The star flared again. This time, for a fraction of a heartbeat, its light went out. The absence was not darkness. It was worse than darkness. Darkness was merely the lack of photons. This was a momentary absence of something deeper, a hole in causality, a hiccup where the equations that governed this tiny sun's behavior failed to produce a value and left a blank. Vale felt it as a pressure in his chest, as if his heart had missed a beat and the rest of his body had not agreed to the pause. The rock around them creaked audibly. The hum froze, then resumed in a higher, panicked register. "Containment field blowdown," one of the technicians shouted from below. "We're losing the inner lattice." "Snap the outer," another yelled. Dump it now." "No," Myra said. It was quiet but carried more authority than the shouted orders. Her fingers danced in the air, manipulating invisible controls. "If we snap the outer lattice while the inner is in a blind, we might punch a hole straight through the chamber wall. We bleed it, we don't crack it." "Bleed it how?" Vale demanded, gripping the rail hard enough that his knuckles blanched. "What happens if it goes?" "You saw the orchard supernova," she said, eyes unfocused as she stared into data only she could see. "Imagine that, but uncontrolled, in a cavity carved into the moon. Lamed's not big enough to take Lunar apart, but it could slag a good chunk of this level, including us." "Then we leave," Vale said. "Now." "We can't," she answered. "The tunnels are part of the metric mesh. If we run while the field is unstable, we could walk straight into a fold. We'd get lost." Her mouth tightened. "We ride it." The pocket star flickered again, its light strobing in sickening pulses. Each pulse came slightly out of rhythm with the hum, as if two hearts were beating against each other in the same chest. Around it, the lattice strained, strands brightening to near white as they fought to wrap a coherent shape around something that no longer wanted to be shaped. And then, in the instant between one surge and the next, Vale saw something reach in. It was not a hand. Hands implied fingers, bones, familiar anatomies. This was more like a suggestion of fingers, an intrusion of a shape that did not quite align with their dimensions. A tendril of absence, darker than the space around it, worming its way through the point where the pocket star's light had winked out. It had no color, no texture he could parse. It was defined entirely by what it erased. For the fraction of a second it was there, the glow of the star cut off not just behind it but around it in a halo. The lattice lines nearest to it quivered, their definitions blurring. The tendril, not even that, a metaphor for something his mind insisted on calling a tendril, probed, tasting. Vale felt the hairs at the back of his neck stand up. The pressure behind his eyes returned, sharper, like invisible claws pressing lightly against his skull. For that heartbeat, he had the distinct, gut-deep sense that something on the other side of this tiny sun had noticed the strained fabric here and decided to touch. Then the star flared back, light slamming outward, and the thing vanished. The lattice screamed in photonic agony as it took the blow. Field nodes popped like overstressed rivets, flinging sparks. One of the technicians below stumbled as his console spat a shower of light. "Did you see that?" Vale whispered. "Shut up," Myra said, and there was terror in her voice now, a rawness he had not yet heard from her. She fed a stream of commands into the chamber. The outer lattice shifted configuration, becoming less like a symmetrical cage and more like a funnel. "We're venting energy into the auxiliary wells," she shouted down. "Brace for load spike." The star began to elongate, its formerly spherical shape stretching along the axis defined by the new field geometry. It looked wrong, stars did not stretch like that. Its surface rippled, then thinned at the center, forming a constriction. The light at its poles brightened, focused into twin jets that lanced into secondary conduits built into the chamber walls. The hum rose into a shriek. The rock under Vale's feet vibrated so hard his teeth rattled. Behind his ribs, his heart hammered a desperate counterpoint. "Metric shear is stabilizing," one of the technicians yelled. "We're drawing it down." On the star's elongated body, dark fissures appeared, like cracks in glass. Through them, for the briefest instance, Vale glimpsed not darkness, but something like a wrongness cut into the air. Not an absence, not quite, more like the suggestion of another geometry pushing at this one. The memory of the reaching thing hung in those cracks like an afterimage. It wants in, he thought wildly. Not the coalition, not the old enemies, something else. Something that lives in the spaces between all this tuned metric, in the folds Myra and her kind had carved into reality. Something that had been watching their pocket games and had decided now to touch back. Then, with a final wrench that made the lift cable above them groan, the pocket star snapped. For a fraction of a second, it was not there at all. No light, no field, no mass. The lattice collapsed inward on emptiness. The hum stopped. Vale's knees buckled. The sudden absence of that constant vibration made his whole body feel as if it were falling. Beside him, Myra swayed, one hand slapping against the rail to steady herself. Below, the technicians froze, staring at their dead center. Then the auxiliary wells roared as the diverted energy arrived. Emergency systems kicked in, flooding the chamber with counterfields to keep the void where Lamed had been from snapping shut like a door on everything nearby. Tiny pocket stars and other chambers flared in sympathetic responses as the bloom's mesh of power distribution rerouted, absorbed, compensated. The hum returned, lower, ragged, like the breathing of a runner after a hard sprint. "Containment," Myra croaked into her link. "Outer lattice holding," came the answer from below. "Core event terminated. We've got a cut, Chief. There's a gap where the manifold just is. We're maintaining boundary conditions to keep it from growing, but there's nothing in there. It's not even vacuum. It's—" "Don't say it," Myra said sharply. "Don't name it." Vale clung to the rail, staring at the place where the pocket star had been. To his naked eyes, it looked like an oddly still patch of air. His band refused to overlay data there. Every attempt to focus on it made his head ache. Something in that empty place remembered the touch that had reached in. Something beyond it, he felt with a certainty that made no sense, still pressed its metaphorical face to the hole, peering through. The sense of being watched rolled over him like a slow, cold tide. Mira turned to him. Her face was pale under the chamber lights, the lines around her eyes deeper. Fear sat there now openly, unmasked, layered under anger and something like grief. "This," she said hoarsely, nodding toward the absence, toward the old chamber and its wounded mesh, "is why we build orchards and ecosystems and pretty little heirloom worlds with painted skies instead of more guns. Because when things break at this scale, it's not just rock and flesh that get hurt. It's deeper." Her hand trembled just once as she pushed hair back from her forehead. "There are prices we've barely begun to tally. And there are things that would like very much for us to lose track of the ledger." He swallowed, his mouth tasted of metal. "What was that?" he whispered, though he already knew she would not name it. She looked at the absence as one might look at a wolf on the horizon, not wanting to give it the satisfaction of fear, not foolish enough to pretend it was not there. "Between things," she said. "Grooves in the math, old habits of a universe that doesn't like being partitioned, hungry spots, choose your metaphor." Her gaze found his again, more tired than he had yet seen it. "We poke at reality, Valkyr. Sometimes it pokes back. You wanted to know where we live now. This is it. In the shadow of pocket suns, under the eyes of things we don't understand, in universes we grew because we weren't allowed to go to the ones you have." She gestured toward the tunnels, the chambers, the humming rock. "Welcome to the bloom." Below them, alarms quieted one by one. Engineers began to move again, voices low, movements precise. The absence at the chamber's heart lay quiet and terrible, a hole around which the entire structure seemed to bend. Vale stared at it until his eyes watered, until the afterimage of its non-shape burned behind his lids. He had come to Saul to learn why humanity had gone quiet. Now, as the moon groaned softly around him and something unseen watched through a wound in the world, he realized that quiet was not peace. It was concentration. It was the held breath of a species that had discovered whole new directions in which to fall, and had stepped off the edge without looking down. For a time afterward, it was all noise and hands, and the desperate, meticulous work of people trying to persuade the universe to forgive a mistake. The chamber's alarms had fallen silent, but lesser sounds rose in their place. Shouted commands bouncing off rock, the sharp crackle of field relays being swapped out, the low, continual murmur of status reports. Technicians in gray and orange swarmed the inner rim like ants around a wound. On the main console bank, diagnostics cascaded and recascaded as the systems tried to make sense of a hole that was not quite a hole, a gap their equations could not comfortably describe. From the balcony, Vale watched them work. The place where Lamet had hung, a tiny sun, was still wrong to look at. It was not darkness. When he shifted his gaze slightly aside, he could see the chamber behind it, the far wall, the scaffolds, the lattice's sagging remnants. But if his eyes tried to focus on the absence itself, they slid like oil on glass. His band, usually eager to plaster predictive overlays on any anomaly, refused. Its only contribution was a small, blinking icon in the corner of his vision labeled metric discontinuity. Do not approach. The engineers tried to approach anyway, in the only way that mattered. They anchored additional field generators around the wound, their housings thunking into freshly drilled sockets with a succession of hollow, metallic booms that vibrated in Vale's chest. They spooled out cables, ran checks, swore quietly. The new generators woke, adding their hum to the chorus of strained stone. Thin sheets of applied spacetime folded over the gap, shimmering like fabric laid over a tear. "We're quilting it," one of the technicians said to another as she tightened a clamp. "Layer by layer. Maybe it'll hold until the mesh reknits. Or maybe it'll make it angry," her colleague replied. "That's not helpful, Jonah." Mira stood beside Vale, hands on the railing, knuckles pale. Her jaw was clenched so tight the muscles fluttered beneath the skin. The terror that had flared there during the collapse had retreated to a hard, controlled line, but it hadn't gone. It lurked at the back of her eyes like a shadow that refused to be chased out of a room. "Do you see it?" Vale asked quietly. She did not answer at first, and he thought she might pretend not to understand. Then she exhaled slow. "Where?" she asked. He pointed, careful to keep his hand from extending over the safety field. "There, in the folds, it moved." "Of course it moved," she said. "The field's oscillating as it settles. You're seeing the interference, not the field," he cut in, his voice low. "The thing in it." She glanced sideways at him. For a moment, their gazes locked. He saw the exact instant when calculation gave way to the knowledge that she could no longer lie to him with anything that mattered. She looked back down. The patchwork of fields over the wound pulsed, an almost rhythmic tightening and loosening as the generators negotiated a compromise with the raw discontinuity. Between two luminous filaments, something bright swam into view. It was only an impression at first, the suggestion of shape where there should have been none. A smooth curve, too precise to be random, traced across the boundary. Then another, intersecting, forming an angle that hinted at structure. Within the gap, thin lines of brightness flickered. No, not brightness, Vale realized with a lurch, but bright by comparison with the hollowness behind them. They were pale, clean, almost bone-white, delineating a frame that his mind squirmed away from fully assembling. A skeletal pattern, he thought, seized by the strangest, most treacherous analogy. As if someone had taken a star and turned it inside out, peeling away the plasma and fusion and leaving only an exposed framework of pure, rigid geometry, all the terrifying architecture that underlied burning. It moved with a terrible delicacy, like fingers testing a surface. Where it touched the field patches, the shimmering fabric bowed inward, straining, then sprang back. The engineer's instruments registered those microscopic deformations as spikes. He saw the graphs jump. "Field integrity dropping to 92%, someone called. Local stress tensor spiking at node 14. "Hold it there," Myra snapped into her link, her voice snapping like a whip. "Feed excess into the auxiliary wells, don't let it thicken. Thin fields can flex, thick ones crack." Commands echoed, adjustments made. The pattern in the gap withdrew a fraction, as if considering. Then it drifted sideways, its lines reconfiguring as easily as a hand changing its angle. Vale thought he saw something behind it, a hint of deeper structure, vast arcs curving away into a space that was not this one, studded with points of light too regular to be stars. Then one of the outer generators flared, dumping an extra layer of lattice over the wound like another patch in a quilt, and the glimpse vanished. The chamber exhaled. Vale realized he'd been holding his breath. Mira's shoulders sagged by the barest degree. "Good," she murmured into the air, more to herself than to her crew. "That's enough for now. Lock in the configuration. Set a drift monitor. If it pushes again, I want alerts trending in red, not amber. And someone get me a full metric map of the discontinuity. I want to know how deep that cut goes." Affirmations came back. "Yes, Chief," on it. Mapping already in progress. The rhythm of work shifted from frantic triage to tense, sustained care. Only then did she straighten and step back from the railing. Her hands shook once, briefly, before she made them still. Vale watched the patchwork over the wound a moment longer. The brightness he'd glimpsed did not return, but the sense of being watched did not fade. It sat at the edge of his perception like a gaze through a keyhole. He turned to Myra. "What is it?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but there was an iron thread in it now, drawn from the same place that had once kept him steady under bombardment. "Not your engineer's euphemisms. Not between things or artifacts. You called it that before, in the first chamber, a between thing, but you knew more even then, and now it's pushed its fingers through one of your sons. I need to know what it is." She met his eyes. The gray in hers had gone flat. For a moment, he thought she might deflect again, might wrap the truth in talk of math and metrics until it choked. Instead, she looked back at the patch over the wound, at the place where the skeletal light had probed their reality. "That," Myra Holt said at last, in a voice drained of all pretense, "is what answered us when we cried into the void." The words fell into him like stones dropping into deep water. For a heartbeat, everything else, the hum of machinery, the movement of people, the ache in his jaw where he'd clenched it, blurred to background. "You called it," he said slowly. "Invited it." "We called something," she replied. "We didn't know its shape. We only knew we needed more. More than physics would allow, more than our own ingenuity could provide in the time we had left. We sent a signal out beyond what we thought were the edges. Something lonely and very old heard us." She shook her head once, as if banishing a memory. "Come on, this isn't a conversation for a balcony." He followed her away from the rail, the wound, the skeletal brightness behind it. The lift took them up and out of the chamber, through the shafts where spacetime's groan softened to a background ache. It released them in a quieter sector of the Genesis complex, a wide, low-ceilinged hall carved directly into the rock, its walls rough and unpolished. Old conduits ran along the ceiling, some capped, some still humming faintly. There were no pocket suns here, no shining fields. Only a single, long table made of dark wood, scarred by years of use, surrounded by mismatched chairs. It felt bizarrely like a family kitchen. Mira sank into one of the chairs with a tired exhalation, as if she'd finally set down a load she'd been carrying too long. She gestured to another. "Sit," she said. "I'll tell you a ghost story." He lowered himself onto the chair, feeling the solidity of the wood under him. Down here, away from windows into impossible universes, away from tiny suns, it was almost possible to pretend he was back on some frontier world, listening to an elder speak of the old days. His bones knew that story shape. Content, he suspected, would be another matter. "You said," he prompted quietly, "that you called them. When?" "Not me," she said. "I wasn't born yet. This was 210 years ago, standard, before the ring, before the war tipped from hot to smolder. You have the old histories, I assume, the archives your coalition kept on our tech base." He nodded. "We know the broad strokes, your first GateNet, the early AIs, the drives that made our admirals sweat." She huffed a humorless breath. "Those were children's toys compared to what came later, but they felt like miracles at the time. We treated them like gods. We thought we'd broken the back of distance. Then the real constraints showed their teeth." She leaned her elbows on the table, lacing her fingers loosely, eyes distant. "Our physics told us what we didn't want to hear. How much energy it really takes to bend spacetime. How fast our civilizations would bleed their wells dry if we kept pushing outward with nothing but fusion and cleverness. We were good at finding workarounds. We built grids, sunk collectors into stars, strung beanstalks and beams across half a dozen systems. But under it all, the numbers stayed ugly. We were, in the most basic sense, spending faster than the universe was willing to pay back. In my people's stories," Vale said slowly, "you were locusts." "Fair," she said. No offense, no defensiveness, just tired agreement. We stripped places. We told ourselves we'd replant, rebuild when we had time. We rarely did. Some of us saw the slope we were on and started to panic. Not the public, not the governments, they were busy with petty wars and politics, but the ones who kept the ledgers of entropy. Her mouth twisted. Physicists make terrible optimists, it turns out. What did they do? He asked. At first, they tried to fix it the old-fashioned way. More efficient drives, better capture systems. We wrung another few percent out of this and that. It wasn't enough. The curve was still bad. She traced a small arc on the table with her fingertip, a descending line. Then someone had an idea. He recognized the tone. It was one he'd heard in his own scientists' voices just before they proposed something that would twist worldviews. What kind of idea? The kind born of despair, she said. They realized that the only way to get what they wanted was to cheat. Not just cheat on scale, the way poking holes in space between 2 points cheats distance. Cheat on the rules, the deep ones. So they asked, what if the laws we've measured aren't the only set? What if the universe had options once, and chose the ones we live under by accident or habit or initial conditions? What if somewhere under the hood other modes still exist, locked but not burned? Vale frowned. That's theology. Or metaphysics, or terribly ambitious physics. Her smile was thin. They built an array, not out in deep space the way your council likes to imagine, not some gleaming temple pointing at a literal edge. There is no edge, as you know, no outside. Our universe is its own border. No, they built it here under our own feet, in caverns not unlike these. She tapped the rock wall. You've already seen its grandchildren. The chambers. The first ones, she said. Genesis, we call them now, a little ironically. They weren't meant for pocket suns. Not at first. They were meant for messaging, for signaling, for making the sort of disturbance in spacetime you can't create with beams and waves, the kind that doesn't travel through the universe so much as rattle the frame it's woven on. She cupped her hands in front of her, as if holding something invisible. They called it the Cry. He saw it in his mind. A chamber larger than the one where Lamit had just died, its walls braced, its field generators straining. A group of humans, pale-faced, exhausted, brilliant, and scared, coaxing spacetime into a shape that shouldn't exist. Not a bubble this time, but a spike, a reach. They tuned it, Myra went on. Not to any point in space, because point doesn't mean much outside the context of our metric. They tuned it to a kind of absence. A gap in the possible configurations, a place where the equations went indeterminate. They poured as much energy as they dared into that gap and shook. They burned a small sun's worth of mass doing it. The chamber melted around them. They died under collapsing rock and failed fields, but the Cry went. She snapped her fingers softly. The trickle of higher-order changes they were trying to make pushed out in all directions at once, not through space, but through the deeper structure. What were they saying? Vale asked. His own kind had sent probes out into dark outskirts of their galaxy, had sent messages in neutrinos and gravitic whispers. But this was different. Mira looked at him steadily. They were saying, help, she said, and trade, and we are here, we are clever, we are desperate, we are willing. He sat very still. He could almost hear the echo of that word help vibrating down generations, a species shouting at the deepest levels of reality like a child pounding on the walls of a house it had outgrown. Your council thinks of us as arrogant, she said. They're not wrong, but the Cry wasn't arrogance. It was the opposite. Admitting we'd run the numbers and we didn't like any story where we stayed within what the universe was offering. Admitting we needed more than we had any right to ask for. And something answered, he said. Not right away, she replied. It took years before anyone noticed anything odd. The arrays they used to measure the Cry's effect melted with the chamber. Most of the records were lost. The few survivors were discredited. Life went on. We fought more wars, built more gates, stripped more belts. Then the anomalies started. She closed her eyes briefly, recalling. Engineers on the outer grids reported fluctuations that didn't match solar cycles. Tiny, local increases in usable vacuum energy. Events where particle pairs popped into existence with a bias, as if someone had leaned on the quantum foam. Lab experiments started returning results a little too good to be true. Devices that should have been marginally unstable stayed coherent. A few bright people noticed the pattern. They dug into the old Cry papers, and they found threads. Threads, Vale repeated. Correlations, she said, between when and where the Cry's effects should have washed through and where the anomalies appeared. It was messy, noisy, easy to dismiss, but if you looked at it long enough, a picture started to emerge. It looked like attention. He thought of the skeletal brightness testing the patched wound, of the feeling of being watched through a hole in reality. We had shaken the frame, Myra said softly. Something on or in or under that frame had looked. Your people kept shaking, Vale guessed. She gave him a thin, curt nod. We built new chambers, better controlled, less suicidal. We tuned smaller cries, we set up detectors to watch for responses. People laughed, called it the Church of the Hollow Star, half as an insult, half out of morbid jokes. Then, one day, a pattern came back that no one could write off as noise. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device, no larger than his palm. It was old, its casing scuffed, its edges worn smooth by handling. She set it between them on the wooden table and tapped its surface. A three-dimensional image blossomed in the air above it, a cloud of points connected by lines, a moving, constantly rearranging web. Numbers scrolled alongside, cycling through representations. "This is a reconstruction of the first clear response," she said. "The hollow star's hello." Vale leaned forward despite himself. The pattern in the air was not like any signal trace he had seen. It was too orderly to be random, too strange to be a familiar encoding. Points lit in sequences that refused to repeat exactly. Lines stretched and shrank, angles flexed. After a few cycles, he realized the whole structure was rotating, but not in 3 dimensions alone. It was as if the rotation had a fourth axis he couldn't see, a tilting in a direction his eyes had no muscles for. "What does it mean?" he asked. "We don't know," Myra said. "We never knew. Our best guesses vary between a map, an introduction, and a joke." What mattered wasn't the content, it was the correlation. This pattern, this precise sequence of events at the quantum level, recurred whenever we threw certain shapes at the frame. We pushed. It sighed back. More importantly, when we changed how we pushed, the pattern changed. Not randomly, responsively. The more we iterated, the more it leaned into the parts of our pattern that contained information instead of noise. "You had a conversation," Vale murmured. The idea made his skin prickle. "Of a sort," she said. "Like talking to an ocean by dropping stones and watching the ripples, or talking to a sleeping giant by poking different muscles and seeing which twitch." It was slow. It was infuriating. It was intoxicating. And, in hindsight, terrifying. Her fingers hovered in the glowing web, not quite touching. Points flared where her hand passed. "We named it the Hollow Star because of how its responses congregated around energy density in our models. They were strongest near the hearts of our biggest sources. Stars, yes. Black holes. The deep quantum wells under certain conditions. Anything that bent the frame hard seemed to carry more presence." She looked at him. "First, we thought that meant it lived in stars. Then we realized that was like saying a fisherman lives in the river instead of in the village on its banks." Vale watched the pattern shift. The lines rearranged into a shape that put him in mind of the skeletal brightness he'd glimpsed in the wound, reduced and flattened into something his poor mind could handle without splintering. A central void, radiating ribs of structure, light clinging to an outline. "It wasn't malicious," Myra said softly. "That's important to understand. At least not in any way we could recognize. It didn't feel like something that wanted to hurt us. It felt curious, hungry, but not in the way predators are hungry, more like lonely." "Lonely," Vale repeated incredulously. "You're anthropomorphizing a higher dimensional field phenomenon." "We only had our own metaphors to work with," she said, unperturbed. "We sent patterns. It answered. When we sent mathematics, it leaned toward that. When someone, foolishly, tried embedding a melody into the cry's modulation, the next response contained a structure that matched its contour. Not perfectly. Not like an echo. Like," she searched for a word, "like someone humming along out of tune, trying to catch it." He pictured it, minds far beyond their own, brushing against a species that had learned to shout into their substrate. An intelligence, or something like it, unmoored from matter as he understood it, hearing, perhaps for the first time in epochs, another voice. "And then you bargained," he said. "And then we bargained," she agreed. She turned off the little projector. The pattern collapsed into a point and vanished. For a moment the only sounds were distant tools on metal, stone settling. "We had a committee, of course," she said. "This was humanity. We never did anything without a committee, a council, and 3 quarreling factions insisting it was all a bad idea. Some said we should shut it down, seal the chambers, pretend the cry had never gone out. Others wanted to throw everything into it, to abandon ordinary physics as a quaint hobby. Most fell somewhere in between. In the end, the ones who controlled the chambers and the energy budgets decided it was worth trying a small exchange." A muscle ticked in her cheek. "They didn't tell the public. They didn't tell most of the governments. They framed it as an experiment in vacuum energy extraction, which in a sense it was." "What did you offer?" Vale asked. The part of him trained in deals and leverage recognized that a bargain was only ever equal in stories. "We didn't know what it wanted," she said. "We still don't, not exactly. It didn't respond to matter being pushed its way as anything more than noise. It ignored our attempts to dump waste heat. Then one of the interface teams noticed something odd. Our detectors, the ones we used to track its responses, started registering faint, synchronized perturbations when certain kinds of human neural activity occurred nearby. Not just any activity, specific patterns. What patterns? He asked, though he already feared the answer. Dreaming, she said quietly. Deep REM, certain meditative states, the brain configurations associated with memory retrieval, with identity processing, with imagination. She looked down at her hands. It paid attention when those were happening. The frame around the chambers flexed differently. It's like it smelled something. His stomach turned. You're saying it feeds on thoughts. I'm saying it reacts to them, she replied. We still don't know if feed is the right word, but the ones managing the project drew their own conclusions. They started designing cries not to push on spacetime in abstract patterns, but to use the minds of the interface crew as part of the modulation. They built neural harnesses that let people think into the frame. Volunteers, at first, the usual mix of idealists, thrill-seekers, and those with nothing left to lose. They dreamed in harness. They remembered in harness. They poured themselves into the cry, and the hollow star leaned closer. He felt cold, suddenly. The rock seemed further away under his feet. It gave us a gift, Myra said. Her voice was very flat now. That's how it felt. A subtle change in the vacuum baseline around the chambers. A tweak in the structure of our local spacetime. Our equations had to grow new terms to fit it. But the practical result was simple. Suddenly, there was more energy available in the midge-space between particles. We learned how to tap it. The first real pocket star was born less than a decade later. Less exploitable but more shapeable, she said. We couldn't rip it out of the vacuum without cost. We tried and things broke, but we could coax it into particular configurations. Funnels, whirlpools, places where energy pooled and matter followed. The hollow star didn't hand us blueprints. It changed the rules under our feet just enough and let us figure the rest out. We built the rest of the bloom on that foundation. And the price, Vale said. You keep talking about the gift. What did it take? She looked up at him then, and for the first time since he'd met her, the calm cracked wide enough for him to see the rawness underneath. It took us, she said simply. Pieces of us. At first, small ones, memories, dreams, little snips cut from the tapes of individual minds. The volunteers in the harness would come out of a session missing a morning, or a childhood friend, or the taste of some food they loved. The Holostar's responses grew richer each time, the anomalies more pronounced. The project leads told themselves it was worth the cost. The volunteers agreed. They called themselves the first offering. Vale's hands tightened on his knees. He thought of his own memories, of his mother's voice, of the smell of rain on the stone walls of his childhood city. The idea of waking one day to find those erased, not faded, not dulled, but gone, left his throat dry. As we learned to structure the cries, the trades got bigger, Myra went on. Not always in magnitude, sometimes in kind. We discovered we could tie the hollow star into more than just individual neural nets. We built bridges into our archives, our history stores, our shared cultural substrates. The first time we did that by accident, we lost 2 hours of tightly logged sensor data. A glitch, we thought, harmless. The next time, entire chunks of a lab's experiment logs vanished. No backups, no trace. Files we'd been looking at earlier that day simply weren't anymore. The lab's personnel remembered having read something, but could not say what. Their minds had gaps shaped like missing facts. Vale thought of the wound in the chamber, of the patchwork fields laid over it. You kept going, he said. Of course we kept going, she said bitterly. We're humans. We keep going in the direction we're already moving until something stops us hard. By then, the energy gains were undeniable. Pocket star prototypes worked. Temporal sculpting became more than a whispered rumor. When someone floated the idea of trying a larger-scale exchange, no one with power said no. She exhaled, a harsh sound. They made a covenant. They didn't call it that formally, not then. It was just Protocol H Lambda in the docs. But the people in the harness started using different words. The covenant of the hollow star, Vale said softly. She nodded. We agreed to give it epochs, she said. Not physical time, narrative time, whole stretches of our story. In exchange, it would deepen the changes, make the new physics more stable, expand the range where we could bend the frame without breaking it. We didn't know if it understood any of that, but whatever it is, it's very good at picking up on the structures of things. We showed it our timelines. It learned the concept. How do you give epochs? The question felt obscene. His people worshipped their history. They carved it into stone, into memory. You build a bridge, she said, between your cultural substrates and the chamber's frame manipulation field. You light up everything from a certain era all at once. Every text, every recording, every brain pattern that references it. You turn that segment of the story into a bright, coherent shape in the sea, then you cry. And it takes it, he whispered. And it takes it, she echoed. The room seemed to tilt around him. He clung to the chair. How many? He asked, not sure he wanted the answer. They started small, she said. At least that's what the records we have left suggest. A decade here, a cluster of events there. Times of shame, mostly massacres, bad wars, plagues, things we told ourselves we'd be better off not remembering. The idea was seductive. Make a payment, gain power, and in the process wipe away some of our worst scars. People argued, of course. Historians screamed. Ethicists resigned. The project went ahead anyway. She gave a short, bitter laugh. It helped that the first payments coincided with breakthroughs that made the GateNet bloom. It's easy to ignore missing pages when you're busy discovering new worlds. And later, he pressed. Later, it grew hungry, she said. Or we did, it's hard to tell. The bigger our bloom became, the more we leaned on the Hollowstar's gifts, the more we wanted from it. Stabilizing pocket universes. Sustaining temporal differentials over long spans, holding metric cuts like the one you saw just now from blowing out. Each time we pushed at the edge of what its modifications allowed, we felt resistance. We negotiated. She grimaced. At some point, the trades stopped being about our past sins and started being about convenience. We gave it slow centuries. Quiet ones. Periods where nothing great or terrible had happened, just people living. They vanished from the tapestry. Our records rewove themselves around the gaps. How can you tell? Vale asked. If they're gone, how do you know they were ever there? She tapped the side of her head lightly. Because sometimes the bridge glitches, she said. Because sometimes someone's wearing a harness when a payment goes through, and the entanglement keeps part of their mind from being overwritten cleanly. Because sometimes artifacts slip. A building with wear marks inconsistent with its official age. A person with a sense of loss they can't name. A song that hums itself in the back of a composer's mind with no source in any archive. Little ghosts, enough to tell us the ledger is longer than it looks. You remember, Vale said quietly, don't you? The silence stretched. The hum in the walls tickled the edge of hearing. Far away, a device chimed and was silenced. Yes, she said at last. Her voice had gone very soft. I remember more than I should, more than any one person has any right to remember. Not everything, not whole epics. I'm not special that way, but I remember a family that no longer exists. He sat very still. Tell me, he said, as gently as he knew how. She stared at the far wall for a time, eyes unfocused. When she spoke again, the words came slowly as if pulled through something viscous. I had a partner, she said. Once. His name, she paused, her brow furrowed. His name was Leo. The syllable came out like a splinter. We met in the early days of the bloom when the pocket stars were still being called mad science. He was an interface tech. Brilliant, reckless, funny. He used to hum when he worked. Little half-tunes. They got into my head. She smiled faintly, and for a moment, the tired engineer watching over pocket suns faded, replaced by a younger version who had laughed more. We worked through nights together in chambers not unlike this. He taught me to love the math and fear it in equal measure. Her fingers flexed on the table as if gripping a memory. We decided to have a child, she went on. In those days, it still felt like a sane thing to do. We wanted continuity, someone to give the universe to, someone who might live under a kinder physics than we had. Her throat moved. Our son was born under one of the early heirloom skies. We mapped his mind to a pocket crib as a backup, just in case. We were so proud of that. 2 worlds for him to grow in. Vale's chest tightened. In his world, children were rare jewels. The idea of losing one was an old nightmare. And then, she said, staring at the grain of the wood, we made a big trade. Her eyes closed. When she opened them again, there was a blankness there that frightened him more than the wound in the chamber had. I was in the harness, she said. Not by choice, not that day. We rotated shifts. It was supposed to be a routine adjustment, a minor cry, nothing like the epic trades, something glitched. Or someone decided to add a writer to the protocol. I never found out which. Her breath hitched once. I felt it when the hollow star leaned in. I felt it brush through my head, through the archives, through the story. It was like having your reflection grabbed through a mirror. I heard people screaming, not with mouths, with lives. And then, she spread her hands. And then Leo never existed, she said. Nor our son, nor the 3 years we had together. Their names were gone from records. The apartment we'd shared had always been a singles quarter. The photos were of me alone. The pocket crib we'd set up had no occupant file. My colleagues remembered working with someone on the consoles beside me but could not say who. Their minds slid off the gap. Only I, her features twisted. Only I remembered, because my mind was inside the bridge when it was used as a conduit. The entanglement protected some lines from being cut, or maybe the hollow star let them be, as a kindness. Or a curiosity. Vale felt the air thicken. You live with ghosts, he said quietly. The understatement was feeble. I live with absence, she corrected. Ghosts would be something. This is missing weight, muscle memory with nothing to attach to. I reach for a hand that isn't there every time I come home. Some mornings I wake up with the taste of toast in my mouth and the feeling of having packed a lunch for a child who never went to school. I can't find the lunchbox, or the school, or the child. She laughed once, a hard, bitter sound. I filed complaints. I tore through backups. I screamed at supervisors who no longer had any forms referencing dependent, Leo 2 Holt. It was like living in a house where the walls had shifted a few millimeters inward and everyone else insisted they'd always been that way. Why stay? He asked. Why keep working with the very thing that took them? She finished. What else was I going to do? Her gaze met his, and he saw in it the exhausted defiance of someone who had long passed the point where turning back was an option. Walk away, pretend the bloom wasn't grafted onto my bones, pretend I wasn't one of the few who could still see how the pieces didn't fit. No, I stayed, partly to keep an eye on the ledger. Partly because, as much as I hate it, I believe we can't unmake the bargain now, only shape its installments. Her mouth twisted. And partly because some selfish part of me hopes that if I stay close enough to the gate, one day they'll fall back through. That some payment will be reversed, some epic restored, and I'll turn a corner and there they'll be, asking why I'm so late for dinner. The rawness in her voice then cut through even his training. For a moment, he was not a coalition agent listening for strategic advantage, but a man watching another human hold the shape of an absence as carefully as if it were a child. I'm sorry, he said, and the words, inadequate as they were, came from a place without calculation. She studied him for a heartbeat as if weighing their sincerity, then nodded once, a small acceptance. That's the cost, she said. Not just mine, we've lost so much. Whole revolutions, movements, quiet centuries, songs, faces. The covenant keeps our engines running. It holds our pocket suns together. It lets us carve universes in caves and run time at any pace we please. But every so often, we feel it pull, and something familiar becomes blur. That's the price of light, Valkyr, we pay in story. He sat back, letting the magnitude of it settle. A civilization that had traded chunks of its own memory to a thing outside, or under, reality for the power to escape entropy's whip. The Coalition's intelligence dossiers had not mentioned this. How could they? How do you record that which has been erased? He thought of his counselors, fretting over fleet tonnage and blockade breaches, soothing themselves with the image of a dangerous animal penned and declawed. They thought they were guarding against raids, incursions, old-fashioned war. They had built their ring to stop ships. How much of you, he asked slowly, is still inside that cage? Mira's lips curved, not quite into a smile. Define you, she said. If you mean the bodies, the infrastructure, the factories, the visible ships, enough. Enough that your ring feels like it's still doing a job. But if you mean the center of who we are, the bulk of our history, the places where our culture breathes, less and less every decade. We've been moving inward into pockets, into far lights. We have cities in universes smaller than your homeworld's capital. We have lineages that have never seen a natural sky. We have archives that exist only in structures whose metrics your instruments would call undefined. You're saying, he said slowly, that from your perspective the blockade already failed. It succeeded at what it was built for, she said. It kept our fleets from spilling into your space. It bought your coalition time. It forced us to stop using the galaxy as a playground. But it did nothing to stop the cry, or the covenant, or the bloom. Those were all under your feet in places your guns don't reach. You built a cage around our bodies. Our minds slipped the bars. He pictured the ring, vast and patient, the ships stationed along it, the crews who believed they were holding back an old foe. He pictured the quiet chambers under Luna, the flickering pocket suns, the universes humming in their cradles. The scale mismatch made him dizzy. You stopped fighting not because you surrendered, he said, voicing the realization at last, because some truths needed air to solidify. Not because we broke you. You stopped because you found another battlefield. Or another way around battle, she said. Physical war feels, quaint now, wasteful. Why throw ships at walls when you can bend the walls or grow new rooms behind them? Some of us still want the old fights. They build their toys. They glower at your ring and dream. but the center of mass has shifted. The real wars now are fought over which pockets get which parameters, which epochs we allow to stay. How much of ourselves we are willing to feed to the hollow star so that our grandchildren can live under kinder equations. A tired smile ghosted across her face. Your admirals are guarding the cage. The beast they fear is already mostly in the cellar beneath their feet, digging stairs upward from somewhere else. The thought chilled him more than the idea of fleets on the march ever had. It wasn't that their blockade was useless, it was that it was mis-aimed. He was a spy who had come to evaluate the weaponry in one armory, only to find the real arsenal hidden in basements he hadn't known existed. Before he could ask another question, a chime sounded softly near the doorway. A voice followed, disembodied but familiar, the same station AI tone that had greeted him on docking. "Myra Holt," it said. "There is an advisory from Oversight regarding the Lamed event. Metric analysis suggests residual entanglement with external observer patterns. Recommendation: perform a cognitive sweep on all personnel present during the discontinuity." Mira grimaced. "Of course there is," she muttered, then louder, "Thank you, Asha. Put the advisory in my queue, I'll schedule scans." "Advisory flagged as urgent," the voice replied politely. "Oversight suggests prompt attention given the nature of the anomaly." Vale's shoulders tensed. "External observers," he repeated. "You mean the hollow star? Or its cousins," she said. "We've never been sure if we're dealing with one thing, many, or a distributed whatever it is. We call them all hollow star for convenience. The models we build for our kids are prettier. Point is, Lamed didn't just hiccup, it connected. And when that happens, some of the attention lingers, in the frame, in the people." She looked at him with uncomfortable clarity. "You were there, standing right over the wound. You need a scan too." He bristled on reflex. "You want to put me in one of your harnesses and let this Covenant thing sniff through my head? I want to make sure it hasn't already taken a bite," she said bluntly. "If there's one thing we've learned, it's that ignorance is the best fertilizer for horror. We map the damage, we watch for new scars, we don't stick our heads in the regolith and hope the screams go away." "And if you find something?" he asked. "Then we decide what to cut out," she said, "or who to quarantine. Worst case, we add another entry to the ledger. Best case, we find nothing and we can both sleep a little easier." He almost laughed. Sleep. As if that were likely again. He followed her down another corridor, narrower, lit with softer lights. It smelled faintly of antiseptic and human breath. The walls here were smoother, clad in a material his band identified as a composite tuned to minimize signal reflections. At the end of the hall, a door slid open onto a room that might have been a cross between a medical bay and a meditation space. Cushioned couches lined the walls, each with a headrest sprouting a complex lattice of fine filaments. Soft sound played from hidden speakers, not quite music, more like the gentle, distant rush of a sea. A few people were already there, lying with their eyes closed, filaments resting lightly against their temples. Their breathing was slow, their faces slack. On a central console, a technician monitored shifting patterns on a screen, colored swirls representing brain activity, overlaid with more abstract shapes Vale didn't recognize. Mira spoke briefly with the tech, then gestured Vale toward an empty couch. He hesitated. Every nerve screamed at him to stay away. His work had always relied on keeping parts of himself walled off, even from friendly optech. To willingly let a human machine map his thoughts, after what he'd just heard about trades and payments, Mira must have read some of that in his face. "You can walk out," she said quietly. "You're not a citizen, not bound by our protocols. I can't force you." "But," he asked, "but if something reached through that wound and brushed your mind, you'll be carrying a piece of it with you wherever you go," she said. "Including, eventually, back to your coalition. If there's a trace, we can at least understand its shape. Maybe blunt it if we do nothing," she shook her head. "I've seen what happens to people who carry those unnoticed. They drift. Their memories stop lining up. They hear things." His skin crawled. "What kind of things?" "Whispers," she said, "like the cry in reverse." He thought of returning to his council with a report tainted by something even he couldn't see. Of standing before the counselor he'd respected and speaking, unknowingly, with a second voice somewhere behind his own. "Fine," he said, more curtly than he intended. "Scan me." He lay on the couch. The cushion molded itself to his shape. The ceiling above was painted not with sky, but with a simple, matte gray and absence of stimulus. The technician, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and gentle hands, adjusted the filament lattice above him and lowered it until it just grazed his scalp, his temples, the ridge behind his ears. "You'll feel a slight tingling," the tech said. "Try to let your mind drift. Don't latch onto any one memory too hard. We're looking for interference patterns. If something pushes back, you'll know. Raise your hand if you get uncomfortable, I'll cut the session. Has anyone ever raised their hand? Vale asked dryly. The tech's mouth twitched. Sometimes they're not fast enough, he said, then softened the words with a shrug. Just breathe, think about somewhere safe. Safe. The word almost made him laugh. He closed his eyes. The filaments hummed, a faint, nearly musical vibration at the edge of hearing. Something cool trickled along his scalp, not liquid but sensation, like the first touch of rain on warm stone. He tried to think of the plateau of his childhood, the stone walls, the smell of dust after the first storm. The memories rose, solid as they always had. He lingered in them, letting their shapes fill him. The scrape of his knees when he'd climbed the wall against his parents' orders. The way the wind had tugged at his clothes, his mother's voice calling him down. The sight of human ships falling through the sky years later, that same plateau now a vantage point for the end of a world. The filaments hummed a little louder. The sense of his body faded, not gone, but backgrounded. The room dimmed. The imaginary plateau sharpened. Then something stepped in front of the sun. He knew, even as it happened, that this was not how the procedure usually went. There was no gentle drift into abstract patterns, no fade into color and tone. The sky above his childhood plateau darkened in a jerking, unnatural way, like a film with frames removed. The human ships froze mid-descent, silhouettes against a sky that had become a flat, leaden gray. A shape loomed. It was not a ship. It was not anything that fit into the comfortable slots of object in his library. It was a hollow brightness, a scaffold of light and absence interlocked. Lines radiated from a central void, not straight, but bending in ways his perspective couldn't follow. Where they intersected, tiny flares pulsed, bright as stars seen from orbit. It was the skeletal design he'd glimpsed in the wound made vast, made real, made near. His heart hammered in his chest, but there was no body beneath him now, no couch. The plateau was gone. The chamber was gone. There was only this architecture, hanging in an infinite, directionless dark. It did not move in any way his eyes could track, yet with every attempted blink, its orientation relative to him changed. He was not sure if it spoke. There was no sound. But something pushed into him, not words, not images, but structures of relation. The way numbers could embody an idea without ever naming it. He felt with a clarity that was not his own the shape of his life as a thread, born on a plateau, walls, ships, loss, training, missions, rooms like the one he'd left behind. The tension of duty and doubt, the recent hum of the bloom, that thread glowed briefly in the hollow star's perception, not as an individual, not as a beloved son, but as a segment of some larger weave. Other threads brushed his, Myra's bright and frayed. 1,000 human lines, each curling inward toward pockets of compressed suns. Farther out, other species' strands, his own people's, tangled with human branches in knots of war. The coalition's web, strung in careful order around systems they called theirs, all of it suspended in the larger scaffold of the hollow star's awareness. He understood, without any words, that the things, the structure felt like many and one, did not distinguish the way he did. He could sense no malice toward one species in particular. It perceived flows, information density, the way memories and identities clustered. It noticed new deviations from whatever background pattern had been its constant for eons. Humanity was a bright knot, the coalition was another. Its attention rested more heavily where the glow was stronger. An impression pressed into him, like a hand against glass. A sense of contract, not in legal language, in the feel of linked structures. We gave. It changed. We owe. It expects. He saw in some impossible meta-memory the outline of the covenant, the first trades, the small ones, the bigger, the epic-sized bites. He saw or felt the hollow star's satisfaction as pieces of human story flowed into its framework, thickening certain strands, filling old gaps. It was not gloating. It was relief, like water running into a dry riverbed. Then something else unfurled farther out. A region of the scaffold was darker, not hollow, dense. The lines there were thicker, twisted around something he could not see. The very feel of it, if feel was the word, made his mind flinch. The hollow star's attention skirted that region cautiously, the way humans walked along the edge of deep crevasses. There was reluctance there, and fear. The structure that had seemed so incomprehensible and vast suddenly felt, in the face of that dark knot, smaller. Like a child avoiding the door of a room it knew not to enter. Images, or their conceptual equivalents, flickered through him, too fast and alien to grasp. He caught impressions, collapsing metrics, cascading erasures, not just of memories but of entire topologies of being. Where once a rich weave had been, only uniform gray remained. The hollow star pressed a pattern into his awareness then, a sequence of events not yet occurred in his frame but present as a possible branch in its. The bloom in stages. First, the power. Pocket stars humming in chambers. Second, the ecosystems, the pockets, the heirlooms. Third, the far lights, the tunnels under reality's fabric reaching for exits other than gates. He saw them as flowers opening, each petal a new universe. Then a fourth. The fourth bloom was different. It was not a single event, not a single chamber. It was a network-level change, a moment when enough of the pockets, the stars, the temporal knots, and the tunnels aligned that the entire bloom flashed as one structure. A threshold. A saturating point where the modifications the hollow star had made to this region of spacetime reached critical connectivity. When that happened, he felt the covenant would complete. It was hard to hold the idea. The hollow star did not care about half payment. For it, the trades were accumulating toward some internal condition it valued. The fourth bloom would tip that balance. Its side of the ledger would cross a line. Then, perhaps by rules older than galaxies, a final adjustment would sweep through. He felt his stomach drop, despite having no body. Just for an instant, the dark region in the scaffold pulsed. The hollow star flinched. Its presence around him contracted. Fear, he realized. The thing that had answered the cry was afraid of what its own bargain would trigger. A cascade of impressions flooded him too fast, pocket universes flickering like sparks, snuffed one by one, histories erased not piecemeal but whole, species waking to find not gaps but absolute smoothness where their stories used to have contour. The coalition's ring shredded not by beams, but by unreality, the very concept of blockade unmade in the minds that held it. He tried to pull back. The structure held him a moment longer, not in malice, but in something like urgency. A new pattern formed at the edge of his awareness, etched in a currency he could understand. Language. When the fourth bloom opens, the cage will break, and something older than your species will walk free. The words did not sound in his ears. They arrived as an arrangement of significance, a mapping of concepts onto a frame his mind could carry. Old, free, cage, bloom, not threat exactly, but inevitability. Then, as if it had overstepped some boundary, the hollow star released him. He fell back into his body like a stone dropped into flesh. The couch caught him, his lungs convulsed. He sucked in air, choking. The overhead gray swam into focus. The hum of the filaments had gone silent. "Easy," the technician said, hands on his shoulders. "Easy, you spiked, I cut the feed." Mira was there too, leaning over him, her face pinched. "Vale," she said, "look at me." He did. For a moment, her features doubled, overlaid with the ghost sense of the skeletal scaffold he'd just left. Then the afterimage faded, leaving only her worn human face. "What did you see?" she asked, voice very low. He swallowed. His throat felt raw as if he'd been screaming. "It talked to me," he rasped. The tech swore softly. "We got interference," he said. "Patterns we don't usually see in baseline scans. It wasn't just echoing your own activity. Something was pushing back." Mira's gaze sharpened. "Words?" she asked. He nodded, then shook his head, groping for how to frame it. Not words, structures. But it translated. At the end. He closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them. The phrase was still there, burned into him with a clarity no erasure could touch. "When the fourth bloom opens," he said slowly, "the cage will break, and something older than your species will walk free." The words hung in the air between them like smoke that refused to thin. "When the fourth bloom opens, the cage will break, and something older than your species will walk free." Vale heard them in his own voice, and in the deeper echo of whatever had pressed them into him, a resonance that made the small scanning room feel suddenly too small, too close to the core of things. The technician stepped back unconsciously, as if the syllables carried a charge. Mira did not flinch. Her mouth tightened, the only sign that something inside her had shifted. She made a small gesture, and the filament lattice above Vale's head retracted, its delicate threads thinning and folding away like a spider's web disturbed. The couch beneath him adjusted, raising him slowly to a sitting position. "Log it," she said to the technician. "Full capture attached to the Lamed anomaly file, tag it priority and restricted." "Yes, Chief," he said, fingers already moving. His hands were steady, but there was a telltale dampness on his upper lip. "Neurometric data too?" "Everything," she said. "This isn't one we can afford to misremember." Vale swung his legs over the side of the couch. The floor was reassuringly solid under his boots. His muscles, unused to the loss of time between perception and body, trembled. "What does it mean?" he asked, hating the thinness of the question and the need in it. He was used to being the one with the hidden knowledge, the quietly informed observer. Here, in these tunnels under a human moon, he felt like a man staring at storm scars on a field and asking a farmer what clouds were. Mira rubbed her palm over her face once, as if smearing away residual patterns. "It means," she said slowly, "that Oversight's worst-case models just got teeth." She gestured toward the door. "Walk with me." He followed her out into the corridor. The meditative sound from the scan room faded as the door sealed behind them, replaced by the low, omnipresent hum of the chamber's infrastructure. Rock wrapped around them, old and dense, carved by human hands into shapes that now held things too big to fit in any skull. They walked in silence for a time. Vale's mind kept throwing up fragments of the scaffold he had seen in whatever space the hollow star used. The lines, the ribs of light, the dark region that even that vast presence skirted. The sense of a threshold, of a ledger nearing completion. He had been trained to compartmentalize, to take overwhelming information and tuck it into labeled mental drawers, to be unpacked later under controlled conditions. This would not fit. It was as if someone had poured an ocean into his pockets. "This isn't the first time the Covenant has spoken," Myra said at last. "Not like that, but close. Every time we push up against a structural limit in the modifications it's made to our local metric, every time we try to do something that isn't supported by the new rules, we get feedback, usually in the form of anomalies. Sometimes in dreams for those of us entangled enough. Once in a while, it burps up a phrase that sticks." Her mouth twisted. Hollow Star was a phrase from one of those, so was First Offering. "And Fourth Bloom?" Vale asked. "Pieces of it have been floating around for a while," she said. "We call the major phases of the bloom blooms internally, more out of habit than poetry. The first was when we turned its gift into sustained pocket stars. The second, when we stabilized closed ecosystems. The third, when the far lights went from theory to functioning corridors into elsewheres. Every time, the hollow star's responses spiked. Every time, the chambers hummed with something like approval." She shrugged one shoulder. "And fear. We're not the only ones who feel the slope steepen. But this is the first time it, or whatever part of it you touched, linked those words so clearly to the cage." "The blockade," Vale said. He saw it in his mind, that immense ring wrapped around the sun's gravity well, batteries and bastions and webs, the coalition's proud monument to caution and control. He imagined it cracking not under bombardment, not under the strain of fleets, but under the weight of an invisible change in the space it sat in. Mira slowed as they approached a heavy door marked with a simple symbol, a circle with 4 radiating lines. She pressed her palm to the plate. It scanned, flashed green, slid open. Inside was a room unlike the others he had seen. There were no consoles, no blinking lights, no hanging harnesses. The walls were bare stone, smoothed but not polished. In the middle of the floor, a large circular table had been carved directly from the rock, its surface meticulously flat. Standing over it, projected in holographic relief, was a map. It was not a map of Sol in any conventional sense. There was the sun at the center, yes, rendered as a simple sphere of light. The planets traced their old, familiar ellipses around it. The blockade ring glowed as a thick band, bristling with nodes. But overlaid on that simple astronomy was a second, more complex layer, a web of curves and surfaces, arcs and knots, some inside the planetary orbits, some beyond. They twisted around each other in ways that made his brain itch, each line colored differently, each node pulsing faintly. He recognized some of the nodes, symbols for chambers on Luna, for pocket star forges, for far light complexes buried deep in rock or floating in high orbits. Other points he did not know. They formed clusters, branches, loops. "This," Myra said, stepping up to the table, "is the bloom as we understand it so far." Vale circled slowly, watching the lines shift as he changed vantage point. "It's everywhere," he said. "I thought the chambers were just on Luna, some stations, a few planetary sites. This," he gestured. The web extended far beyond the moon, out past Mars and the asteroid belt, tendrils reaching into the outer system. "We started under Luna because it was convenient," Myra said. "Solid rock, old infrastructure. People used to tunnels. But once we understood how to anchor pocket stars in different gravitic wells, we expanded. There are chambers on Mars, under the ice of Europa, embedded in the skeletons of old stations. The far lights, they're not all in our system either." Her fingers danced in the projection, highlighting distant nodes that shimmered faintly, labels flickering into existence in human script. "Outposts in systems we can't reach with conventional drives anymore because your blockade protocols would flag the energy signatures. We got there by stepping sideways." You've been seeding? He searched for a word that encompassed enough. Roots, through our own space, right under the watch of our patrols. We've been planting anchors, she corrected. Not weapons, not in the conventional sense. Each node is a pocket star or a cluster of them. Each pocket star is a knot in the modified metric the hollow star gave us. Together, they make a network. That's the bloom. The fourth bloom, she pointed at 4 large nodes, each pulsing with a slow, heavy light, one deep under Luna, one near the Earth-Sun Lagrange point, one in a halo around Mars, one out near the Kuiper Cliff where the sun's influence began to wane, is when these 4 go into resonance. He was starting to see it, in the way his training allowed him to see patterns in battle maps. You're going to ignite them, he said, simultaneously. We already run them, she said. They power half of what you've seen, but mostly in isolation, carefully staggered cycles, gentle hums. Her eyes were on the map, not on him. We've modeled what happens when we align them. In theory, if we tune them correctly and feed them enough matter, they'll push the local metric into a new configuration. Not just in the chambers, not just along the far light corridors, everywhere their knots reach. Space itself will shrug. And the blockade, he whispered. The blockade sits on the current shape, she said. Its orbits, its anchor points, its fire arcs, all calculated in a geometry we've already bent once. When the fourth bloom opens, those calculations will be wrong. Mass will still be where it is. But the way gravity drapes around it, the paths that light and ships prefer to take, the cost of moving from one point to another, all of that will be different. She traced a line along the ring. Your cage will still be there, Valkyr, but the bars will no longer line up with the thing it meant to encircle. That's, he searched for words, insane, brilliant, reckless. All of the above, she said. For the first time since the Lamed incident, a spark lit her eyes that wasn't fear or weariness. We thought of attacking the ring directly, building weapons big enough to punch holes or small enough to slip through and bloom inside. Some still argue for that. Every scenario we ran ended in your council throwing everything they have at us. Rocks, stars, the sort of tantrum we don't survive. This is softer. We're not breaking your cage. We're stepping sideways out of the space it occupies. And if your admirals are as cautious as I've heard, they won't fire blindly into a metric they no longer understand, not right away. That buys us time. Time to do what? He asked, though he already guessed. To migrate, she said. Not armies, people. Worlds in pieces. Our bodies have been trapped here for 40-odd years, our minds less so. It's time to bring them back into alignment, to let the heirlooms breathe in a larger sky, to get out from under this shadow. Her gaze swept the map. We intend to light the fourth bloom and ride the wave out, through the far lights, through new corridors into regions of the universe where the Covenant's modifications aren't as thick, where the ledger hasn't carved as deep. And if the Hollow Star's message is right, Vale said slowly, when you do that, something older walks free. Mira's jaw clenched. We've known for a while that there was a downside, she said. We didn't know its shape. Not really. Oversight has models, of course. There are always models. Most of them involve losing more of our history in the shock. Some involve the bloom collapsing in on itself, taking Saul with it. But she tapped the table once. This is the first time we've had such a clear hint that the cage we're breaking is not just yours. It's something deeper, something that even the Hollow Star fears. Then why do it at all? Vale demanded. If the fourth bloom opens a door for whatever that dark region is, why not stop? Decommission the bloom, kill the pocket stars, go back to fusion reactors and slow ships and being penned in. Live but small. Her laugh was soft and short. You don't know us very well if you think that's a live option, she said. We've already integrated its gifts into our infrastructure. We can't unneed them. And even if we could, the modifications have been made. The frame has been reshaped. The Hollow Star's attention is here. You can't uncry. The fourth bloom isn't some optional upgrade we can delay indefinitely. It's a threshold built into the way the network has evolved. If we don't choose when to open it, it will open itself at the least convenient moment. Her eyes bored into his. I'd rather shape it, write it, try to redirect the fallout, maybe turn the older thing's attention somewhere that doesn't immediately eat us. Or the coalition, he said. Or the coalition, she agreed. I don't want your people erased any more than I want mine devoured. We have enough blood between us. He stared at the map. The 4 nodes pulsed, slow, fateful hearts. What do you want from me? He asked, the question he kept circling back to, stripped now of pretense. Nothing, she said, surprising him. And everything. I won't ask you to sabotage your own. I won't ask you to become our courier of secrets. You've seen enough to know we're not bluffing. We will light the fourth bloom with or without your blessing. I'd prefer with your understanding. She gestured at the map. You have choices. You can go back to your coalition and tell them what you've seen. They'll likely panic. They may try to strike before we're ready. They may kill millions in the process, or they may hesitate, debate, waste time. You can stay. Help us shape the ignition. Carry news later when the dust settles, or never. You can also walk away entirely. Find some outer rock to curl up on, pretend the universe isn't about to change under your feet. She shrugged. I can't make that choice for you, and I won't try. I've had enough of other people deciding who gets erased and who doesn't. He appreciated in some distant corner of his mind the honesty of that. No threats, no bribes, just a map and the admission that the train was leaving whether he got on it or not. His loyalty rose up prickly, to his people. To the counselor whose quiet fear had sent him here. To the memory of walls falling under human fire, of his world's sky striped with the burn of their drives. The coalition had its sins, its arrogance, its blindness. It had also been, in fits and starts, a bulwark against chaos. They were his kin, his duty. But duty to what? A ring guarding the wrong door? A council arguing over shadows while the foundations shifted under them? He thought of his mother's hands, rough from stone and work, lifting him when he was small. Of the human commander who had walked through his city's ash with tired eyes and had said, "We can't keep doing this." Of Myra's lost son who had never existed. Of the children in the pocket realms, dancing under skies that could vanish with a miscalculated trade. Your kind built cages of metal, the hollow star had pressed into him. Their kind builds cages of light. Neither are strong enough. He did not tell Myra that part yet. Some words needed to settle before they were shared. Give me time, he said instead. I need to think, she nodded. We have a little, she said. The ignition's not tomorrow. We have to patch Lamed, recheck the mesh, verify we can handle the stress. Oversight will scream if we rush, but not much. The network's already ringing. The hollow star is closer than comfortable, and the coalition isn't blind. They've noticed the metric anomalies. Their scientists are scratching their heads. Their admirals are getting nervous. We move before their nervousness crystallizes into orders. How long? He asked. Days, she said. Weeks at most. Not years, not anymore. He left her there with the Bloom's map, the lines and knots painting her features in shifting light, and wandered. He walked through Luna's concourses, watching people who did not yet know, could not fully know, what their engineers were about to do to their sky. Or perhaps they did, and they carried it in the set of their shoulders, the way his own people had once carried the tension of imminent war. He listened to vendors haggling over food, to children arguing over a game, to an old man in a corner bar telling a story about the time he'd seen Earth from a free orbit before the ring went up. Their voices braided into a tapestry that felt heartbreakingly ordinary against the backdrop of the map in his mind. At a viewport overlooking Luna's scarred surface, he stopped. In the distance, one of the chamber complexes rose from the regolith, its towers gleaming cold in stark sunlight. Beyond it, the Starforge stacks were visible, their spindly silhouettes rippling with heat ghosts. Farther still, Earth hung in black space, blue and white and impossibly fragile. He put his hand against the transparent panel. It was cool under his palm. If he went back now, if he hijacked a ship or coerced a message through the nets or walked into one of the official liaison offices with an honest report, what would happen? The coalition's analysts would pore over his testimony, weigh it against their fears. Some would argue to open channels to humanity, negotiate a managed ignition, collaborate on containing the older threat. Others would insist on preemptive strikes, hammer the chambers, break the bloom before the fourth bloom opened, accept the collateral losses as the price of safety. He knew his own factions. He had seen their debates over lesser uncertainties. With something this big, this poorly understood, panic would win. And what would a strike look like? Kinetic lances driven into Luna's rock to shatter the chambers, directed energy beams across the ring, spearing the known forges. Miscalculated, they could rupture containment fields, rip open pockets, tear deeper discontinuities. The older thing behind the cage might not wait for the fourth bloom's neat timing. It might spill through wherever the frame was weakest, lured by chaos. His loyalty wasn't just to his species. It was to the galaxy they all shared. He sank down on a bench by the window, feeling suddenly old. A child's voice interrupted his spiral. "Mister," it said, "are you okay?" He looked down. A human child, maybe 8 or 9, stood nearby, clutching a string attached to a small balloon that glowed softly. Her hair floated slightly in the moon's lesser gravity, a dark halo. Her eyes were wide and curious, the way all young things were before someone taught them to narrow. He began, then stopped. Honesty had been doing strange things to him lately. "I'm thinking," he said instead. She nodded solemnly. Grown-ups do that when they're sad, she said. My mom says it's because their heads are too full and their hearts forget how to float. Despite himself, he almost smiled. Your mom is wise. She works in the chambers, the girl said proudly. She says we're going to make the stars grow in new directions. She held up the balloon. She made this. It's a tiny one, a pretend one, for practice. She squinted at him. Are you from outside? He hesitated. Yes. Is it scary? She asked. Yes, he said again, surprising himself. And beautiful. She considered that, then beamed. That's what Mom says about the chambers, she said. She says everything important is both. Your mom is right, he murmured. She nodded as if this settled some private debate. Bye, mister, she said, then skipped off, the little glowing balloon bobbing like a toy sun behind her. He watched her go, the thin ribbon pulling at his heart as much as at her hand. He thought of Myra's erased son. Of all the children in the pockets whose worlds might shudder when the fourth bloom opened. He thought of his own people's children, under skies that had never known a bloom, their parents trusting the coalition to keep them safe from human fire. He sat there until Luna turned enough that the chamber in the distance slipped out of view and the blockade ring edged into sight, a faint, dark line against the stars. If he went back, if he told the council everything, they might avert one catastrophe only to unleash another. If he stayed, if he helped Myra shape the ignition, he would be complicit in whatever horrors and hopes it birthed. There was no clean path. There rarely was, he thought. His work had always been in the gray spaces between. That night, if night meant anything on a station where day cycles were artificial and tunnels ran deep enough that stars were only a rumor, he dreamed. He knew it was a dream because the plateau of his childhood and the chambers, hollowed rock, existed side by side, because the blockade ring hung in the sky and looped under his feet, because he looked down at Earth and saw it as both marble and map. And because the hollow star was there, a presence more felt than seen, its scaffolded shape ghosting across constellations. Your kind built cages of metal, it pressed again as if clarifying its earlier message. He saw the ring, its guns, its fields. He saw smaller cages too, prison cells, station hulls, dockyard grids, attempts to make order hold. Their kind builds cages of light. He saw the pocket stars now as bars, each not in the bloom a point where reality was bolted down. He saw far light corridors as rails. The pockets themselves were rooms, cells, houses built in new neighborhoods of spacetime. Human hands on all of them. Neither are strong enough. A flicker of the dark region. The sense of something pressing from beneath, from beyond. Not like the hollow star's structured attention. Something blunter, older, less fine. You fear each other, the hollow star pressed, and there was an alien amusement in it that did not mock so much as observe. You guard against each other's heat, but the blaze is elsewhere, in the spaces you have already opened. He felt its own fear ripple through the scaffold. The fourth bloom is a key, it impressed. Not of my making alone. We altered the frame together. You cried, I answered. Something listened behind us both. The ledger runs deep. Can we stop it? He asked aloud in the dream, his voice thin under the weight of all that structure. Stopping is not in your nature, it said, and there was a note almost like fondness in it, the way one might speak of an unruly child. Or mine. But you can choose where the cracks open. You can choose what to anchor. You can choose to be gate or gatekeeper or only noise. He saw then, in some impossible, compressed way, a vision of the fourth bloom not as catastrophe, but as configuration. The four great nodes pulsing. The bloom's lines flaring, the pockets lighting up. The hollow star's modifications reaching saturation. The older thing beyond shifting, smelling freedom. The cage of metal, the blockade, crumpling as the geometry it depended on slid sideways. The cage of light, the bloom, stretching, some bars bending, some holding. He saw human hands reaching into the structure, not as small, panicked flailings, but as gestures born of generations of living inside miniature universes. They knew how to tweak fields, how to tune time, how to grow stars that clung to the underlying fabric. Pocket suns, once just seeds and tools and curiosities, became pegs hammered into a sheet that wanted to tear. Your council sees them as beasts to be penned, the hollow star impressed, and for a moment he thought he felt a hint of his own counselor's tired eyes in that emphasis, as if his memory had colored the message. They are gardeners of geometry now. Dangerous, yes, but not only to you. And me. Vale asked, suddenly and deeply tired in the dream as he was waking. What am I in this? You are a thread that touches both webs, it said simply. That is rare. The words came not as flattery but as observation. Were you not, some tension can be redirected, or you can fray and be nothing. Its scaffold rippled. The choice is yours. There was an impression then, the faintest, of something like regret. I cannot choose for you. Cages I understand, choices less. He woke with the taste of stone and starlight in his mouth. The days that followed moved with the inexorable pace of tide coming in. On Luna and Mars and under Europa's ice, engineers worked in concentric circles of secrecy and urgency. Lamid's wound was quilted layer by layer, its patch monitored constantly. Other chambers were stress-tested, their pocket stars coaxed through carefully graded flares. The Bloom's map was updated hourly as minor nodes were rerouted, their load lightened or increased. In the far light corridors, traffic patterns shifted quietly. Less freight, more infrastructure. Vale watched it all with the slightly detached clarity of someone who had decided something and had not yet said it aloud, even to himself. He tried once to compose a message to the coalition. In a secure alcove, he sat with a clean slate and brought up the standard encryption schema used by field agents. The interface blossomed in front of him, offering templates for reports, contact summaries, technological assessments, psychological profiles. His fingers hovered over the input. How do you compress pocket universes and ancient covenants and the fourth Bloom into bullet points? How do you tell a council that the war they think they're fighting is both over and irrelevant, that the cage they built is about to be outgrown in a way no amount of gunfire can prevent? How do you warn them of a looming, older threat without making them reach for weapons that will only crack the frame further? In the end, he wrote only one line: "Your cage is not holding what you think it is." He stared at it. It was true and useless and insufficient. He deleted it. The slate cleared with a soft, neutral chime. When he found Myra again, she was in one of the starforges, watching as tenders fed lengths of decommissioned hull into a pocket star's radiance. The metal glowed, softened, broke down into constituents that were siphoned off and reassembled into components for the Bloom's anchors, recycling on a stellar scale. "This is where you live," he said, recalling her question from days ago. She glanced up, then back at the forge. "Where I spend my time," she said. "I don't know if that's the same thing." "I spoke with it," he said. "Again, in a dream or something like one?" She did not ask what he meant by it. "And," she asked instead. He told her in quiet, careful words about the cages of metal and light, about the hollow amusement, about the fear around the dark region, about the fourth Bloom as key, about gardeners of geometry, about threads. She listened without interrupting, only occasionally flicking her gaze to a nearby console as alerts chimed softly. When he finished, she stood very still for a time, the forge's light painting her profile in harsh relief. "That tracks with some of our own entangled experiences," she said at last. "Different metaphors, same bones, oversight will want to hear it if only to confirm their assumptions." "Do you ever think you're mad?" he asked abruptly. "All of you, down here humming new physics, talking to things older than stars, carving universes under rocks. Maybe the ring up there is the sane line and you've wandered too far past it to see." She laughed, softer than he'd expected. "Every day," she said. "And then I walk through a pocket where a civilization has spent 10,000 subjective years figuring out a way to grow food without killing their world, and I think, no, this is sanity, however skewed. The madness is what we used to call normal." She looked at him, the light catching the lines at the corners of her eyes. "Have you decided?" He took a breath. It tasted of metal and heat and the faint, mineral tang of moon dust in the filters. "If I go back," he said slowly, "the best I can do is sow confusion. Maybe buy you some time, but time is not what you're lacking, not now. If I go back and they believe me, they might panic and strike, and in striking, tear bigger holes. If I go back and they don't believe me, I will have burnt my credibility and gained nothing." He let the words settle. "If I stay, I can help shape this. Maybe, a little. Enough to direct one crack away from one floorboard." "Your counselor will feel betrayed," she said. "He already feels betrayed," Vale said. "He just doesn't know by what yet." He swallowed. The next words were harder than he'd anticipated. They tasted like treason and like alignment. "I can't be part of guarding a cage that's aimed at the wrong monster anymore," he said softly. "If there's something older coming through when you light this, I'd rather stand next to the people who know how to fix torn fabric." Mira's shoulders dropped a fraction, as if some tension she'd been holding without admitting it had eased. "Then stay," she said simply. "No triumph, no relief, just acceptance. I won't lie for you," he added, more for himself than for her. "If I ever speak to them again, I'll tell them what I see. I'll warn them when I can. I won't become a weapon against my own." "I wouldn't trust you if you said otherwise," she replied. "We don't need another blind loyalist. We need someone who can see both sides of the frame." She held out her hand. He looked at it. The fingers were calloused where tools had worn them, the nails short, the skin faintly cross-hatched with scars. He took it. "Welcome to the bloom," she said. The day of the ignition ceremony came with no fanfare on the surface. Luna's sky, what there was of it, under domes and through viewports, looked the same. Earth turned, wrapped in its weather. The ring glided in its old, tight path, guns pointed outward and inward. In the concourses, people went to work, to school, to beds. Traffic moved along corridors. Machines hummed. Underneath, everything trembled. In the chambers of Genesis and their later descendants, engineers and technicians and wardens took up their places. They stood at consoles, yes, but also in open spaces around pocket stars whose light had been dimmed to a careful simmer. They wore harnesses not just for neural interfaces, but for physical grounding, as if they expected the floor to tilt and wanted to be tied to something other than equations. Mira stood in the central coordinating chamber, deep under Luna. It was a space carved bigger than any Vale had yet seen underground, a cathedral hollow in stone. The ceiling arched high overhead, its rough contours traced with a lattice of field projectors and sensor arrays. In the center, on a raised dais, a cluster of control pedestals had been arranged in a circle. From each, filaments rose like vines, prepared to drop onto the heads of those who would serve as the ignition's human interface. Around the dais, in concentric rings, the chamber's staff stood, their faces lit by the ambient glow of dozens of holofeeds showing pocket stars across the system. The 4 great bloom nodes pulsed larger than the rest, each in its own corner of the display sphere. They were not alone. Smaller nodes clustered around them, their satellites, their petals. Vale stood at the inner ring just outside the circle of pedestals. He had refused a harness. His mind was tainted enough. Instead, he would serve as observer, as extra pair of eyes on the patterns, as someone who knew how the coalition might react when their instruments screamed. Mira stepped up onto the dais. She wore no special regalia. Her jacket was the same gray workwear she'd always worn. Her hair was tied back in a rough knot. Only her eyes were different, steady and very, very clear. She took her place at one of the pedestals. 3 others did the same. A man whose beard was shot through with silver and whose hands trembled slightly until he curled them into fists. A young woman with dark skin and tattoos on her forearms that traced equations. A non-binary person with hair cut close on one side and long on the other, their gaze distant, as if already half attuned to something outside the room. The 4 of them formed a cross around the dais. Mira looked out at her people. The murmur died. "We're here," she said, her voice carrying not just through speakers but through the chamber's very air. There was no rhetoric in it, no grand flourishes. "We all know what we're about to do. We've run the numbers. We've argued the ethics. We've mourned what we've already lost. We've put names on the ledger. There's nothing I can say that will make this safer or cleaner or less frightening." She paused. "I will say this, we are not doing this to strike a blow. We're not warriors today. We're migrants, gardeners, wardens. We are trying to move our roots before the ground beneath us gives way entirely." She rested one hand lightly on the pedestal's edge. "We've spent generations building cages of light," she said. "Pocket stars, pockets of time, pockets of reality. They have sheltered us, they have tempted us, they have cost us. Today we're going to see if they can hold more than our own weight." Her gaze flicked, just for a heartbeat, toward Vale. "We are not the only ones in danger if we fail." She took a breath. "We've lost people to the Covenant," she said. "We've traded things we can't get back. We've made bargains we didn't fully understand. If there are gods listening, they would be justified in turning their faces away from us. But I don't believe in gods. I believe in us. In our stubbornness, in our capacity for joy and harm and repair. I believe in the children in the pockets and the old ones on hospice rings and the people in this room who have gone into the harness again and again because someone had to. I believe we can take the danger we've unleashed and turn it into something that keeps more than just our own skins intact." She looked up at the hollow of the bloom. The 4 great nodes pulsed, slow and heavy, waiting. "Let's open the 4th bloom," she said, "and keep the sky from falling." There was no cheer, no applause. People nodded or closed their eyes or reached out to squeeze the hand of the person next to them. One by one, in the rings around the dais, they began to murmur names. Not of heroes or generals, of spouses, children, friends, teachers, the dead and the erased, a low litany of memory. It rose and fell like a tide. Mira lowered the harness onto her head. The filaments brushed her skin, sank into the ports along her temples, spread their fine pale threads across her scalp. The others did the same. The pedestal surfaces lit under their hands, a soft, steady glow. Vale watched the data feeds. In the chambers across Luna and Mars and Earth's orbit, pocket stars shifted as their input parameters changed. Their surfaces, once simmering gentleness, began to seethe. Field lattices hummed louder, their lines brightening. In the far light corridors, metrics flexed, their usual subtle folds deepening. Bloom 1, the chamber AI intoned, its voice calm, a ritual caller. Node lunogenesis, begin alignment. At the far edge of the hollow, the first of the 4 great nodes flared. The pocket stars anchored there, deep under Luna, brightened. Their combined field extended, reaching out along the lines of the bloom, thickening the threads. Bloom 2, the AI said. Node Terragate, begin alignment. In high orbit around Earth, in stations that had once mounted weapons now repurposed as lattice hubs, pocket stars pulsed. Their light bled into conduits, into far light corridors, into tiny universes rooted to their fields. Bloom 3, Node Aries Deep, begin alignment. Under Mars, in caverns mirrored after Genesis, a cluster of pocket suns woke. Their hums joined the chorus, deep and resonant, like a new note added to a chord. Bloom 4, Node Kuiperfar, begin alignment. At the fringes of the system, where sunlight thinned and the blockade's watch was lazier, a distant complex of machinery that the Coalition had catalogued as observation station lit. It was no simple station. It was a starforge in its own right, anchored to the subtle curvature at the edge of Sol's gravitational influence. Its pocket stars flared for the first time in concert with their inner cousins. The Bloom's map came alive. Lines that had been faint pulsed bright. Nodes that had been independent sank into synchrony. The 4 great elements beat together, their cycles phasing into a single, massive rhythm. Vale felt it in his bones. Gravity didn't change yet, not in a way bodies could feel. But something in the way his inner ear sounded the room shifted. The hum in the rock rose. In the ring, instruments screamed. On the blockade bastions, alarms blossomed across consoles. Sensor officers, used to the slow, predictable fluctuations of solar weather and station traffic, stared as their boards lit up in colors that had not been tested outside simulation. Metric anomaly, their systems flashed. Gravitic flux, field discontinuities, unknown. Long-range telemetry showed the Bloom nodes as flares of unnatural brightness. To Coalition eyes, they looked like weapons charging. Messages flew along the ring. Orders, counterorders, standing directives brought up from dusty databanks, protocols for dealing with catastrophic local spacetime instabilities. They had been written for hypothetical scenarios involving failed gate experiments or black hole manipulations. No one had expected to use them here now. Do we fire? A young admiral demanded of an older counselor patched in via tight beam. They're doing something, all our readings. If you fire blindly into a changing metric, you risk hitting your own flanks, the counselor said, his voice thin over the delay. Hold your fire until we have a clearer picture. Get the science teams on this, now. We may not have until, the admiral snapped. If there, his words blurred as the hawking monitors spiked. In the chambers, the 4th Bloom reached its inflection point. Space around the 4 great nodes began to curve not just inward, as under normal gravity, but sideways. It was as if someone had taken the familiar rubber sheet analogy of spacetime and pushed their fingers up under it in 4 places at once. The sheet bulged, dipped, rippled. The bulges sent waves outward along the Bloom's threads. Where those waves met, they interfered, forming standing patterns. Mira's fingers moved on her pedestal, guiding. In her harnessed mind, she lived in the Bloom now, her sense of self stretched thin along its lines. She felt the pulses from Luna's core nodes, from Terra's halo, from Ares' deep forges, from Kuiper's far anchors. She coaxed them into alignment, using the memories of countless pocket stabilizations as her palette. The hollow star leaned in. It was not visible, not in any direct way, but its presence pressed against the modified frame. It had invested heavily in this region of spacetime. The changes it had made, at humanity's urging, at humanity's trade, resonated. Now, as the Bloom flashed toward saturation, it poured attention into the structure. It was not guiding. It could not dictate the precise shape of the Bloom any more than a river could tell a dam exactly where to break. But its presence amplified. The energy density in the metric spiked. At the edges, the older thing stirred. In the dark region Vale had glimpsed in his dream, in that twisted knot of erased topologies, something flexed. It had not been created by the hollow star or by humanity. It was older, as old as the rules that had once been chosen and then forgotten. It had slept, in a sense, in the gaps between workable universes. The cry, the modifications, the trades, the Bloom, the 4th Bloom, these had shaken its cage. The frame's weakness was its language. Now it heard the hinges squeal. The blockade ring shuddered. From the perspective of those aboard its stations, the first sensation was nausea. Not from motion, their bodies were still tracked to the ring's spin and the gravitational grips of their artificial gravity. It was deeper, like the vertigo one felt when looking over an unexpectedly long drop. Instruments designed to report velocities and vectors spat nonsense. Distances between known points flickered, shortened, lengthened, without any actual translation of the underlying masses. In long-term data stores, a stranger thing happened. The records of where the ring had been, its path plotted over decades, its precise ephemerides, suddenly failed to match the new calculations. It was as if the universe had quietly decided that the ring had always been in slightly different positions than they remembered. Navigational software crashed, then rebooted with new baselines the crews hadn't entered. Outside, to observers far enough away that they could see Sol as a point, the change looked like a brief, luminous shiver. A tightening of the light around the system, a momentary brightening and dimming as if the star had skipped a beat. Inside, reality snapped. The Bloom nodes reached full resonance. Their combined fields intersected in a complex interference pattern that extended across the entire volume of space the ring had encircled. For a heartbeat, the metric froze in that pattern like a photograph of ripples. Then it reconfigured. The cage broke, not in the dramatic, cinematic sense of metal sundered and beams exploding. The ring's hardware held. The guns, the bastions, the nets, they all remained where they were. It was everything else that moved. Distances shifted. Paths warped. The most efficient, lowest energy routes between points now bent around the Bloom's anchors instead of through the gaps the ring guarded. Gravitational wells subtly rearranged their influence. Objects that had been in stable orbits found themselves on slightly different tracks. In some cases, those tracks no longer closed. A few small stations, unlucky in placement, started slow, inexorable drifts either outward, toward looser space, or inward, toward new, unexpected attractors. For the ships of the ring's fleet, the world became a nightmare. Trajectories carefully maintained for decades suddenly led nowhere expected. A destroyer holding station at a particular coordinate found itself, in the span of seconds, tens of kilometers closer to a bastion than it should have been. Its collision alarms screamed. Its helm fought phantom vectors. Gravity acting like it's drunk, one pilot grunted, knuckles white on controls, as his vessel's inertial dampeners struggled to keep up. We're not moving, but everything else is. In Earth's sky, the blockade's line wavered. To people looking up from the surface, through the gaps in domes, from the windows of towers, the ring's regular arc shimmered like a mirage. For a moment, it seemed to dissolve, its segments slipping sideways. Then it stabilized again, at a slightly different angle, its geometry out of tune with the planet's now subtly altered well. In the chambers, the pocket stars bloomed. Coaxed by their handlers and by the hollow stars leaning, they flared without breaking. Their field lattices, once cages, now reached outward along the Bloom's lines, not to contain, but to anchor. Each pocket sun sank hooks into the underlying fabric, tiny, intense points where the new metric was nailed down. The older thing pressed. In the dark region, a crack opened. It was not a crack in any ordinary sense. It was a transition in phase space, a point where the rules on one side differed from those on the other. Through it, not matter, not energy, but potential oozed. The kind of potential that had eaten universes before, smoothing their rich tapestries into uniform gray. The hollow star shuddered. It turned, in whatever sense a higher dimensional attention could turn, and braced itself against that crack. Its scaffold, built of centuries of trades and modifications and human dreams, strained. For a moment, it considered letting go, allowing the older thing to flow through and wash away the turbulent, noisy region that had caused it so much pain and pleasure. It would be easier. The ledger would clear, the ache would end. But in the Bloom, human minds burned like candles. In pockets, people sensed the change without knowing its source. In a violet sky city, gravity tilted and then righted, and a street full of dancers found themselves briefly weightless, laughter turning to shouts and back. In a contemplative world where monks had spent lives tracing the subtle curves of modified metrics, the ground under their temple trembled, and their equations hummed in concordance with a new note. In a wargame realm where tacticians had been simulating conflicts their bodies would never see, the horizon's edge rippled, and their simulated armies froze as their terrain shifted. Some prayed, names spilling from their mouths into skies that were not those of Earth. Some cursed. Some, like a group of children in a pocket forest where the leaves glowed when songs were sung, simply held hands and watched with wide eyes as the stars above rearranged themselves into new constellations. In the real sky over Earth and Luna, new lights appeared. They did not come from rocket flares or standard drives. They bloomed from far light nodes whose connections had been until now mostly one way, inward. As the fourth blooms wave past, those nodes' fields inverted. Instead of pulling metric walls in, they pushed them out, creating corridors that did not so much tunnel through space as rewrite which points were adjacent. Ships moved. Some were human craft long hidden in inner harbors, built in dry docks carved into asteroids, in bays under oceans. They had hulls designed not for bristling weaponry, but for surviving in the weird currents of the bloom's modified geometry. At their hearts, pocket stars burned, their fields integrated into the ship's structures. When these vessels activated their drives, they did not produce thrust in any conventional sense. They stepped. From Luna's hidden bays, from Mars' deep slips, from stations disguised as derelicts, ships stepped into far light corridors and emerged not at the ring's gates, not along known lanes, but in the spaces between, where the blockade's guns had no firing solutions. To an outside observer, they seemed to ghost, their positions hopping in ways that violated every treaty and intuition. Vale watched on the chamber's hollow as markers representing those ships winked into existence outside the ring's effective radius. Some moved outward along new paths toward distant stars. Others hovered near, their roles more complex. First waves away, someone reported, voice tight. Migration convoys clearing the inner wells, far light corridors holding at 93% stability. Second waves readying, another said. Pocket mass transfers aligning. Pocket mass transfers. Entire sections of pocket universes, their metrics folded appropriately, being moved as cargo. Parts of heirloom worlds plucked from their cradles under Luna and receded along far light branches in deeper space. It was not whole civilizations moving in one go. That would have been more than even the bloom could handle. It was seeds, arcs of a new kind. In the ring, captains stared at screens showing impossible ship movements and wild gravitational readings. Some ordered weapons locked, fingers hovering over fire commands and then pulling back as their targeting systems failed to provide clean solutions. Ships that tried to fire found their beams bent, their missiles' trajectories skewed. The bloom had changed the path of least resistance for energy and mass. Weapons designed for the old geometry flailed in the new. Stand down, the counselor's voice came again over the network, harder now. This is not a battle we can win with force. All units maintain position. Focus on protecting your own structural integrity. We will reassess once the anomalies settle. In the chamber, Myra and the other harnessed wardens sweated. Their bodies stood still on the dais, but within the bloom they were running, hands out, catching slipping fields, redirecting strains. When the older thing pushed at the crack, their pocket stars brightened of their own accord, as if some instinct older than programming told them which way to lean. The Covenant's true form stirred. If the hollow star was scaffolding and river and attentive loneliness, this was something else. It had no scaffold, no clear structure. It was an erosion, a smoothing, a hunger for uniformity. It did not hate, it did not want in the way creatures want. It functioned. Where the frame was weak, where complex weaves had been frayed by too many modifications, it spilled evening. In older cycles, in other regions, it had washed through entire realities, leaving behind nothing but a bland, stable substrate in which nothing interesting ever happened again. A mercy, perhaps, for universes tired of their own noise. It flowed toward Sol. At the edge, the hollow star braced. In the modified region, the bloom's anchors held. The crack widened, but not as fast as it might have. Places where there were no pocket stars, no cages of light, no adjusted metrics, thinned. Places where the bloom's roots were thickest resisted. Mira, half suspended in the interfaces, felt it as a pressure at the edges of her perception. An urge toward forgetfulness. A temptation to let go of the hard shapes, the particularities, the messy entanglements of history and identity. It whispered, not in words but in ease. If she surrendered, the ache of a erased family would vanish. The ledger would reset. There would be no more cost. She snarled, a sound her body on the dais did not make, but that echoed through the bloom's structure. Her pocket stars brightened. In the templated universes where monks traced metrics, bells rang unbidden. In wargame realms, peace broke out as simulated combatants dropped their weapons, compelled by a sudden nausea at conflict. In the Violet Sky City, the dancers' steps shifted, aligning with a rhythm that matched the bloom's heart. Humanity pushed back, not with guns, with stories. People in pockets told tales of their own worlds to each other, unsure why they were suddenly compelled to speak, but speaking anyway. Of rivers that had never existed on Earth, of skies that had never seen Sol, of love and loss under artificial constellations. Their words rippled through the cognitive substrates underpinning their realms, thickening the pattern, making it more costly for the smoothing wave to erase them. In the physical universe, on ships stepping outward, captains recited the names of their ancestors like spells. On Luna, in small apartments, parents held children and whispered lullabies that had once been sung under completely different stars. On the Ring, even coalition officers, feeling a wave of dizzying blankness wash through their memories, clung to recall the names of ships, of battles, of fallen comrades. Vale felt it too, that pull. For a moment, the plateau of his childhood blurred. The walls of his city, which had stood so solid in his mind, wavered. Human firestorm and rubble and ash and the feel of dust on his knees threatened to drain away into a gray pleasantness in which nothing had ever been lost because nothing had ever been. He clenched his hands, nails biting his palms. "No," he whispered, and pushed his story back into shape. He remembered his mother's rough hands, his father's quiet anger at the human ships, the smell of rain, the crack of the first bomb. He remembered his own hatred, his training, the first time he had read a human poet and felt something twist, Leo, who he'd never met, and the erased son whose absence stood beside Myra at every console. The plateau, the chambers, the hollow star's lonely, awful curiosity. He braided them together, a rope against smoothing. In whatever space it did its work, the hollow star felt that. The resistance, the refusal, it was not used to being refused. The civilizations it had dealt with before, in cycles lost to erased epochs, had either burned themselves out before they could build such structures, or surrendered entirely, letting it guide them into quiet dissolutions. Humanity was strange. It fought not only outward but inward, tooth and nail, for its own noise. The Bloom's pocket stars pulsed. Each served as a tiny, defiant anchor. Together, they formed a skewed, shimmering lattice around Sol, not unlike the blockade ring in metaphor, but operating on a deeper level. Where the older erosion tried to push through, it hit these anchors and flowed around them, diverted. It lapped at the edges of pockets and found their stories thick, their metrics knotty. It gnawed, but it did not sweep. The cage broke. The beast within took a step, but the world did not end. When the wave passed, the hum in the chambers lowered from shriek to rasp, then to something like the old bass line, albeit richer. The Bloom's map showed new lines now, new densities. The 4 great nodes had dimmed slightly, their energy spent, but their fields held. The crack at the edge of the modified region remained, but it had not widened in that one furious rush. The older thing had tasted, tested, but found the path less easy than expected. On the blockade ring, crews sat in shock, staring at recalibrated instruments. Their cages of metal and fields still wrapped the star, but the thing they had encircled had shifted. The paths by which ships could come in and out no longer matched their interdiction cords. The treaties that had codified which lanes were open and which were death sentences now read like nonsense. On Earth's surface, people looked up and saw new stars in their night sky. Not because distant suns had moved, but because far light nodes and ships now hung in positions that made them visible. Constellations were subtly wrong. In the chambers, the harnesses lifted. Mira sagged, supported by the filaments for a moment before they withdrew. Her knees buckled. Vale moved without thinking, stepping up onto the dais to catch her. She was heavier than she looked, or perhaps he was merely drained. "Did we?" he began. "We're still here," she said hoarsely, her voice raw. "That's a start." "You felt it," he said. It was not a question. She nodded, eyes unfocused for a moment as they tracked something only she could see. "I felt an offer," she said, "and a threat, and us." Her gaze sharpened. "We anchored, not perfectly, not enough to be smug, but enough to keep the floor from dropping out entirely. For now." Her team around the dais began calling out numbers. Kuiperfar fields at 78% and rising, repair crews already rerouting strain. Lunagenesis stable within acceptable margins. Terragate experiencing minor residual discontinuities but pocket containment holding. Aries Deep has some cracks, we'll need to dump a few test pockets, but the main stars are fine. And outside, Myra called, far light corridors are different, someone said. But they're there. First wave convoys are beyond the ring. Signal lag confirms they made it. Vale glanced at the external feed. Tiny markers representing ships, scattered like seeds just beyond the blockade's former reach. Some were on paths that would, if unimpeded, take them to other nearby stars within reasonable subjective times. Others hung in weird, looping orbits around new attractors, patches of slightly different metric, places where the bloom had left its fingerprint. He watched, and something in his chest loosened. Humanity was leaving. Not in a flood, not yet, but in trickles that would add up over time. The cage of metal had not stopped them. Coalition response? Myra asked. Confused, came the report from a liaison console monitoring intercepted transmissions. They're in full anomaly analysis mode. Science teams arguing with Fleet Command. Some want to reach out diplomatically. Others are yelling about preemptive strikes. No consensus. Their own drives don't behave exactly the way they expect anymore. They're cautious. Good, Myra said. The tension around her mouth didn't wholly ease. Let them argue. We have our own fires to put out. She turned, met Vale's eyes. For a moment, the chamber, the hollow, the people fell away, and it was just the two of them standing in a quiet room that happened to be carved into the heart of a hollow star's altered domain. You're sure? She asked quietly. Still, he understood the question beneath the words. Now that the fourth bloom had opened, now that the cage had broken in the way it had, did he regret his choice? Was he going to run back to the ring, to his council, to his old definitions? He thought of the hollow star's scaffold, braced against an older erosion. Of human children holding glowing balloons and ancient monks tracing curves. Of the coalition crews on the ring, sick and bewildered and alive. Of Myra's erased family and the countless invisible casualties of the Covenant. Of his own people, their walls, their ash. I'm here, he said. And there's still work to do. She nodded once. Then come on, she said. The Forge isn't going to rebuild itself. In the days that followed, the world, the many worlds, did not settle so much as find new orbits around a changed center. The bloom's pockets experienced aftershocks. Some small universes collapsed, their metrics unable to handle the stress. Their inhabitants, if they had any, were lost or folded into backups imperfectly. Oversight added their names to a ledger already too long. Others thrived. The heirloom worlds with the oldest, most robust structures rode out the wave like old ships in a storm, battered but intact. Their peoples looked up at their artificial skies and found new stars there, connected to far light corridors they'd never known existed. Options multiplied. The far lights themselves had changed. Their paths no longer followed neat curves through a largely uniform metric. They threaded through knots and ridges now, rich terrain for those willing to map it. Humanity, with its generations of experience living in bent spaces, took to it with frightening speed. Their new drives, built around pocket stars and anchored to the bloom's lines, began to define a new kind of motion. Not jumps, not warps, but steps along pre-stressed seams. The coalition watched. Their scientists tore at the data, building new models, revising old ones, cursing human recklessness and admiring, reluctantly, their ingenuity. Their admirals repositioned fleets, less concerned now with holding a ring that no longer held, more with preventing panic. Some voices in the council argued for open war to crush the chambers, consequences be damned. Others, remembering the feeling of blankness that had washed over them during the ignition, wondered if perhaps human cages of light had just held something back that none of them were equipped to face alone. Vale contributed where he could. Through channels Myra knew and trusted, he helped craft messages that could be intercepted, nudged, leaked to coalition analysts. Not blueprints of the bloom, not secrets that would let them build or break pocket stars, but context. Hints, warnings, your cage is not holding what you think it is. The danger is older. We are trying to hold the door. Help, or at least don't kick the supports out. He did not know how those messages were received. He imagined arguments in council chambers, hands steepled, voices raised. He imagined his own name being spoken with anger or pity or grudging respect. It hurt, in a way that reminded him of the hollow star's concept of trade. He had given up a certain kind of belonging for this. In the forge, Myra returned to work. The Starforge bays were busier than ever. Where once they had focused on producing pocket star components for internal chambers, they now turned out parts for ship drives, for far light nodes, for new kinds of anchors designed not just to hold pocket universes, but to pin down the frame against future waves. Humanity, having just narrowly avoided being smoothed, was in no hurry to relinquish its new role. They were becoming wardens. Not in the sense the coalition had once imagined, with humans standing over other species wielding weapons. In the deeper sense, of tending a broken universe. The Holostar's modifications had left scars. Some spaces, once smooth, now had permanent ridges. the older erosion would keep pressing, probing for weaknesses. Where there were no occupants, no stories, no anchors, it might succeed. Where humans built cages of light, it would find more resistance. Mira walked through a new chamber under Europa's ice one day with Vale at her side. The pocket stars there were young, their fields still being tuned. She spoke of designs for anchors that could be seeded not just in their system, but in others. Of collaborations with pocket-born civilizations who understood better than anyone how to live under modified metrics. Of the monstrous arrogance and necessity of a species that had already traded parts of itself to a lonely god now deciding to stand against an even older force. "We're the ones who broke the cage," she said, tracing a hand along a newly installed field node. "We cried," it answered. "We shaken the frame so hard that old locks cracked. That's on us. But now that we see what was behind the door, walking away isn't an option. We don't get to pretend it's someone else's problem. We made ourselves responsible." "You really believe we can hold it," Vale said. It sounded less like skepticism than hope he was afraid to own. She considered. "I believe we can slow it," she said. "Divert it. Maybe give pockets of the universe time enough to live interestingly before the smoothing wave finds them. That's more than most cycles have had, if the hollow star's hints are to be believed." "You're making yourselves necessary," he said. "We're making ourselves useful," she corrected. "There's a difference. Necessary implies the universe won't function without us. It will, it just might be duller. I don't want to live in a dull universe. I don't want my erased sun to be justified." Her eyes hardened. "If we can, with all our mess, be the ones who keep the sky wrinkled a little longer, I'll take it." Vale thought of his own people of the coalition. "And us?" he asked. "Where do we fit in your picture of wardens?" "Wherever you choose," she said. "You can stay outside, sulking in your metal cage, pretending it still means what it used to, or you can step in, not under us, with us. You have your own skills, your own scars. I'm not interested in a galaxy where only humans hold the broom." He imagined, not without difficulty, a future in which his people learned the math of pockets, built their own cages of light, anchored their own regions. In which the coalition, born as a reaction to human expansion, evolved into something else. A partner in holding the frame. It was a distant vision. There would be fights, misunderstandings, ancient grievances. But the alternative, everyone for themselves, under the slow advance of the older thing, felt worse. One evening, if one could call the artificially dimmed cycle an evening, he stood again at a viewport watching a ship leave Luna. This one was different from the stealthy migration convoys. It was declared lit visible. Its hull was long and graceful, built around a central spine. Along that spine, several pocket star housings glowed, their fields faintly visible like halos. As Vale watched, the ship engaged its bloom drive. Reality around it rippled. Not much, not dramatically. Like a heat haze. One moment the ship was there. The next, it stepped. It did not fade or streak. It was simply in a slightly different relation to everything else. A far light corridor extended from its wake, a luminous thread connecting 2 points that had not been neighbors before. Inside, people, Myra had called them pilgrims, would be watching their screens, their windows, their metrics, as the universe bent just enough to let them pass. Mira came to stand beside him. She had grease on her hands, as always, and a smudge of something darker on her cheek. She smelled faintly of metal and incongruously coffee. "Where's that one going?" he asked. "Somewhere we've never been," she said. "Star 98 in a catalog of anonymous numbers. It has a decent metallicity, a few promising rocks, a quiet local metric. We're sending them with a couple of anchor kits and a lot of curiosity. The idea is to seed anchors not just here, but out there. Spread the load." He watched the ship shrink. "And you?" he asked. "You could go, far away from the Covenant's reach, start fresh." She shook her head. "I'm a warden engineer of the pocket stars," she said. "My place is in the forges and the chambers. I'll go someday maybe if we ever find a place where my skill set isn't needed. But that day isn't soon." Her gaze stayed on the ship until it slipped beyond even the enhanced view. "My child is nowhere," she said softly, "and everywhere. In every pocket we saved, in every anchor we plant. If I can keep them from being erased a second time, that'll have to be enough." He turned that over and found no argument strong enough to dislodge it. In the quiet that followed, as Luna's rotation brought Earth out of view again, he felt a familiar pressure at the back of his mind. The hollow star, leaning. It did not flood him this time. It did not show him scaffolds or dark regions. It touched lightly, like fingers testing a wound. "This is only the first cage to fall," it whispered, not in sound, but in the arrangement of concepts his mind translated into words. "There are others. Older, deeper. Your metal rings, their light nets, my own bounds, all fragile." He thought of that dark region, of the way the older erosion had pressed and been diverted. Will they all break? He asked inwardly. He did not know if it could really hear him in the human sense. The question felt small. Breaking is not always loss, it impressed. Sometimes it is growth, sometimes it is collapse. The difference lies in what steps through. It felt thoughtful for a being so vast. You have tied yourselves to the frame now, small, loud ones. You will feel every crack. Is that a warning? He asked. An observation, it replied, perhaps also appreciation. You have given me much in trade, more than I understood at first. You may yet give more. The older thing presses. I fear it, you fear it. Fear is connective. He almost laughed. We're in this together, he said, and the absurdity of feeling kinship with a being that had erased parts of his ally's history did not escape him. For now, it said, the pressure withdrew, leaving him with the sense of being very small and very noticed. Mira glanced at him. Dreaming awake? She asked. Listening, he said. Anything good? He considered. It thinks this is just the beginning, he said. That there are more cages, more cracks, she sighed. Of course it does, she said. If the universe ever gives us a quiet epilogue, I'll die of shock. He huffed a laugh. Would you want that? He asked. She thought. Maybe for a few years, she said. Long enough to remember what boredom feels like. Then I'd probably start poking at something again. She smiled, thin but real. We're not built for stasis. You and I, we're gardeners of geometry now, whether we like it or not. He looked out at the stars, at the faint smudge where a far light node shone, at the barely visible line of the ring that had once seemed so absolute and now looked like an old fence on an expanding farm. I think, he said slowly, I can learn to live with that. Behind the moon, under its scarred skin, in halls where tiny suns burned in cages of light, humanity set to work on the next generation of anchors, drives, pockets. Above, in space bent by their bargains and their defiance, ships stepped outward along luminous corridors. On the ring, coalition crews recalibrated and argued, and in some quiet corners, contemplated reaching out to the very ones they had once caged. In the strained scaffold under all of it, a lonely, ancient attention watched through cracks and knots and cages, its fear of an older erosion braided now with a new, unfamiliar sensation. Hope. This is only the first cage to fall, it whispered, to no one and to everyone.